Welcome back once again. Before we start, please comment down where you are and what time it is currently. Thanks, and let's get to it. The house on St. Andrew Street looked quiet from the outside. It was the morning of March 1st, 2000, when police knocked on the door, responding to concerns from John Price's co-workers. He had not shown up for work, something completely out of character. Price, known as a reliable man in the small community of Aberdeen, New South Wales, had not called in sick. He simply vanished. Outside, his neighbours stood uneasily, whispering among themselves. The officers pushed their way into the house. What they discovered would shock the entire nation. Behind that door lay one of the most disturbing murder scenes in Australian history. The first officers entering the bedroom were hit by a smell so overwhelming that many had to step back outside. John Price was lying lifeless under bloodied sheets. The violence inflicted upon him was unlike anything even experienced detectives had encountered. His body bore wounds so severe they hardly seemed real, but as they moved deeper into the house, the horror multiplied. Blood trailed through the rooms, smeared across walls, soaked into carpets, and then, in the kitchen, they found the true extent of Catherine Knight's brutality. On the stove, simmering in pots, were parts of Price's body. Plates had been set on the dining table, 2 place settings, each with a serving of cooked flesh, vegetables, and gravy. Next to the meals, his children's names were written on notes. It was chillingly clear what this meal was meant to be. Knight had taken Price's life in the most violent way imaginable, and then staged a grotesque scene that investigators could barely process. For a town accustomed to petty crime at most, this was something else entirely, something that felt almost inhuman. This was not ordinary violence. Even in a world where murders occur daily, this stood apart. Seasoned detectives later described being physically shaken by what they saw. One officer, hardened by years of work in homicide, reportedly could not return to the force after that day. Another officer recalled, "It is the type of crime scene you cannot unsee." The Australian press would soon label Catherine Knight as the nation's first female murderer to be imprisoned for life with no possibility of release. But before the trial, before the media frenzy, there was the question almost everyone asked. How did someone like her come to commit something so horrific? In true crime stories, there is often an attempt to trace the path backward, to follow the strands of a person's life leading to the moment of violence. With Catherine Knight, that path is deeply unsettling. She was not a stranger, unexpectedly breaking into someone's home. She was Price's partner, someone he knew intimately, welcomed into his daily life, and trusted against the warnings of many friends. She had a history, a long, documented record of abuse, threats, and violent outbreaks. Yet she walked freely among her community until everything culminated in this night. As investigators pieced together what had taken place, they understood this crime was not driven by sudden impulse. Catherine's brutality showed planning. Evidence around the house suggested she had prepared for this evening in advance, waiting for the moment to strike. Files she left behind pointed to motives tied to anger, rejection, and revenge. And while she was found unconscious at the scene after a failed overdose attempt, the timeline built by police stitched together how events unfolded. It was not madness in a fleeting second. It was an explosion of violence that had been building for years. Aberdeen, a small, working-class town, known mostly for its abattoir and tight-knit community spirit, reeled after news broke. Everyone had known Catherine in some way. She was not an outsider who appeared suddenly. She grew up nearby and spent her working life in the same environment as everyone else. People had heard whispers of her temper, the stories that circulated about knives, fights, and her obsessive control in relationships. But no one there could reconcile the woman they knew with the crime described in the newspapers. This was their neighbour, the woman at the pub, the co-worker on the floor of the meatworks. Now she had become the name on every headline. The brutality of Knight's crime forced Australia to ask difficult questions about domestic violence, mental health, and the limits of intervention. John Price had taken steps to protect himself, at one point obtaining a restraining order. But he also, out of some combination of loyalty, fear, and lingering affection, let her back into his life. Friends reported he often shrugged off worries, saying he could handle her. Yet, in the weeks before his death, he told those close to him that he feared he was in real danger. It was not enough. So, how did a woman born into a working-class family, who became a mother, partner, and everyday member of her town, eventually commit Australia's most infamous act of domestic violence? To answer that, it is necessary to turn back to the beginning, to her earliest years. Catherine Knight did not become violent overnight. Her life was marked early by turmoil, anger, and the inability to manage relationships without lashing out. Every chapter leading to that night offered glimpses of what she might become, yet each time the danger escalated, she remained unrestrained. Like a dark pattern repeating over and over, each relationship pushed her further. Her childhood and her environment set the tone, and her adult life showed how those tendencies deepened. Before the headlines and the trial, before she became Australia's most notorious female killer, Catherine Knight was simply an angry child in a violent household. What happened inside those walls, and how those experiences shaped her, gave the first hints of what she would one day unleash. To understand the night of horror in March 2000, we need to start nearly half a century earlier, in 1955, when she was born into a family already fractured by scandal, anger, and the seeds of destruction. By the age of 15, Catherine Knight had already left school. She was still unable to read or write, but that did not stop her from finding work. In Aberdeen, the local abattoir was one of the biggest employers, and Catherine followed the path taken by many in the town. For her, the slaughterhouse became not just a workplace, but a setting where her fascination with knives came into focus. She reportedly thrived on the act of cutting meat, describing it proudly to others. Where colleagues often saw the job as grim necessity, Catherine seemed energized by it. Workers recalled how she treated knives with respect, almost like prized possessions. She took a set home and kept them hanging above her bed, a place of honor where she could see them every night. This was not simply habit, it was ritual. Knife work became her identity, blending with the aggression and instability already rooted in her childhood. For Catherine, sharp blades carried both practical skill and symbolic power. But her work life was not her only source of notoriety. Outside the slaughterhouse, Catherine was already known for her short temper. Street fights, aggressive outbursts, and threats became part of her reputation in Aberdeen. She did not shy away from confrontation. When provoked, or sometimes when something barely annoyed her, she could quickly turn to physical violence. Many people gave her a wide berth. Even male co-workers, hardened by physical labor, admitted they were wary of crossing her. Her early romantic relationships reflected this same dangerous pattern. Catherine developed an intense, almost obsessive approach to partners. At first, she could appear affectionate or even shy, but those who grew close to her soon saw another side. Her possessiveness translated easily into control, and then into eruptions of violence whenever she felt challenged. She was not content to argue. She reached for fists, objects, or knives in situations where most people might walk away. One of the early warning signs came in an incident where Catherine attacked a partner over a confrontation that seemed minor on the surface. Stories vary, but all accounts agree that knives were involved, establishing what would become a recurring threat. She had learned early on that brandishing a blade got results. The other person backed down. The tension broke in her favor. This instinct hardened into dangerous habit. Her community had few illusions about her behavior. By her late teens, Catherine was already infamous locally. The pub scene, central in small-town Australia during that time, quickly spread stories about her violent streak. If a man crossed her, word was he could expect fists, kicks, or weapons. Yet, despite everything, she continued to draw partners. Some were intrigued by her fiery personality. Others may have underestimated the danger until it crept too close. There were moments when Catherine seemed to crave stability. She voiced desires for long-term relationships and family life, but her execution was warped by a need for control. Instead of nurturing connections, she tested boundaries with intimidation. Violence became both a way to punish and a method to pull others back into her orbit. To her, aggression was not necessarily the end of love, it was folded into how she maintained it. Aberdeen's people often chose silence. Small towns sometimes prioritized privacy over open confrontation, and many who knew of her violence did not report it. Police encounters with Catherine in these early years remained limited, often because victims hesitated to press charges. Fear and shame kept people quiet. This lack of intervention allowed her to escalate unchecked, each near miss reinforcing the sense that she could do as she pleased. Catherine's early adulthood set the tone for everything that followed. She combined violent impulses, deep insecurity, and obsessive attachment. Every relationship seemed to end with chaos, yet she continued to draw people back in with charm when it suited her. Each partner faced the same cycle, affection giving way to possessive rage, arguments spiraling into assaults, and eventually, threats with knives. Looking back, these early incidents form the blueprint of Catherine Knight's life. The fascination with blades, the pride in her ability to dominate, and the refusal to let go of partners all point to patterns that only intensified. Her work at the abattoir sharpened her skills, while her unstable personality weaponized them. The young woman who once frightened classmates had now become a partner who terrified men twice her size. By the time she approached her first marriage, Catherine's identity as a dangerously violent individual was already sealed. Friends had seen the warning signs, partners had felt them up close, and the town as a whole knew her name carried trouble. Yet nothing and no one stopped her. What had started as unpredictable outbursts in childhood had grown into a lifestyle defined by violence. The disturbing patterns of her youth were no longer just hints of trouble. They were clear, established, and escalating towards something even darker. By the late 1970s, Catherine Knight's reputation in Aberdeen was already well known. She was tough, quick to anger, and not afraid to pick a fight. But then she met David Kellett, a local man who drank heavily but had a much more easygoing personality. On the surface, they seemed an unlikely pair. David was known around town as someone who enjoyed nights at the pub and rarely avoided a beer. Catherine, meanwhile, had an intimidating temperament, volatile outbursts, and a fascination with knives that unsettled people. Yet, for reasons that baffled many who knew them, the two began a relationship. David himself had his struggles. He worked on the railways and drank heavily, often to excess. He did not shy away from dangerous situations, but he was not considered aggressive in the way Catherine was. What he lacked in violence, he made up for with tolerance, and that seemed to be what Catherine required in a partner, someone who would take what she dished out. By 1974, they were officially married, a union that locals believed was bound to end in chaos. Their wedding day quickly confirmed those suspicions. Most weddings end in celebration, but for David Kellett, his marriage to Catherine Knight started with fear. On their wedding night, Catherine attempted to strangle him. Accounts later revealed that Catherine was furious when David fell asleep without initiating sex. Her rage escalated, and she violently attacked him, nearly choking him before he escaped her grip. It was a shocking start, but instead of leaving the marriage then and there, David stayed. Perhaps he thought it was a one-time episode, perhaps he hoped she would calm down, but it was only the beginning of a nightmare. In the months that followed, their marriage became a cycle of violent outbursts, apologies, and further violence. Whenever David attempted to assert himself, Catherine lashed out. She grew controlling over who he spoke to and where he went. Fights often ended with her threatening him physically. On several occasions, she struck him with household items during arguments. The violence was not random. Catherine wanted to dominate her partner completely. David learned quickly that standing up to her only escalated things. Fear became the foundation of their marriage. The levels of threat Catherine created extended beyond her husband. On one occasion, when their daughter was only a few months old, Catherine placed the baby on nearby train tracks shortly after a heated argument. She then went into town flaunting a stolen pram, leaving the child in extreme danger. Luckily, a local man spotted the infant and rescued her moments before a train was due. Catherine was later hospitalized and treated briefly for postnatal depression, but the system failed to recognize just how dangerous she had become. David took her back, continuing to live in terror of her next unpredictable act. Another notorious incident occurred when Catherine violently slashed him with a frying pan in the middle of an argument. On another occasion, she attacked him with scissors. Even in the face of this, David found himself trapped in the marriage, too intimidated to leave outright. If he attempted to escape, Catherine tracked him down and threatened further violence. She wielded knives openly during disputes, an unmistakable reminder that she was capable of lethal harm. Her manipulation was just as powerful as her physical abuse. Catherine often used her children as pawns, threatening to harm them if David attempted to walk away. She accused him of infidelity whenever he resisted her control. When jealous, she destroyed his belongings, slashing clothes or tearing apart possessions in acts of pure rage. To outsiders, she sometimes appeared doting, but behind closed doors, she kept David in a state of submission through terror. In one particularly chilling moment, Catherine slashed the face of another woman in town simply for speaking to David. This act of public violence sent a clear message not only to her husband, but also to the community. Crossing Catherine came with severe consequences. By then, people whispered about her cruelty, yet officials did little. Few wanted to confront her directly, and those closest to her were too repressed by fear to make official complaints. Eventually, the cycle of violence pushed David to his breaking point. After yet another brutal episode, during which Catherine threatened to kill him while he slept, David left. This time he fled the town, leaving Catherine behind. His departure angered her, but it also freed him from the daily assaults and constant state of fear. For many years after, David spoke about the sense of relief he felt once away from her. Still, the scars from the marriage were not only physical, he carried lasting trauma from having been in her orbit, describing his time with Catherine as a constant negotiation with violence. The breakdown of their marriage stands as one of the early examples of just how dangerous Catherine Knight could be. What began on their wedding night as an attempted strangulation continued into nearly a decade of physical attacks, threats against his life, and psychological torment. David was not the only partner she treated this way, but living through her brutality taught him what others would later also discover. Leaving Catherine was not simple, and surviving her control required sheer luck. For the community of Aberdeen, the collapse of their marriage was unsurprising. People knew her temper. They knew her fascination with weapons, and now they could see the lengths to which she would go to exert control. Catherine Knight's union with David Kellett ended up being more than just a failed relationship. It was a chilling demonstration of how violent she was capable of becoming behind closed doors. And tragically, in the years to come, other men would step into that same cycle, unaware of just how deadly it would eventually become. After the collapse of her marriage to David Kellett, Catherine Knight did not retreat into quiet life. Instead, she very quickly entered into another relationship. This time it was with David Saunders, a 38-year-old miner who had moved to Aberdeen in the mid-1980s. At first glance, the relationship offered Catherine a fresh start. Saunders, older and financially stable, seemed capable of dealing with her rough edges. Within weeks of knowing him, Catherine was already hooked. Her charm worked as it had before, as she showered him with affection, gave the impression of stability, and pulled him deeper into her orbit. But those familiar with Catherine's past knew the calm never lasted. The first few months were steady, even promising, but soon her jealousy surfaced. She suspected Saunders of cheating whenever he came home late, or wanted to spend time apart. Her accusations were sharp, her anger immediate. Catherine's mood swings repeated the old patterns, moments of warmth followed by violent blow-ups. Saunders confessed to friends that he was walking on eggshells, unsure which version of her he would face each night as he stepped through the door. Violence against Saunders arrived suddenly and without warning. Catherine punched, scratched, and on more than one occasion used objects in the home as weapons during arguments. When words were not enough to intimidate him, she escalated. Once, after becoming convinced he planned to leave her, she struck him with a frying pan and chased him out of the house. Her attacks were not only reactive, they were deliberate displays of control meant to frighten him into submission. One of the cruelest acts occurred when Catherine killed his dog, a small puppy he cherished. Accounts say she slit the animal's throat in front of Saunders as punishment for what she imagined was infidelity. The intent was clear. She wanted him to understand that if he defied or abandoned her, she was capable of destroying what he loved. The killing horrified the community when details later came out, and it marked a new depth in her campaign of psychological terror. Despite that horrifying act, Saunders stayed with her on and off for several years. Like her previous husband, he was caught in the web of abuse and reconciliation. Catherine regularly threatened him with knives, at times holding them to his throat. On better days, she convinced him she wanted a family and domestic life. They even had a daughter together, and for a brief period Saunders hoped the violence might calm down now that Catherine was a mother again. But it did not. If anything, the child became another tool for control, a bargaining chip in their fights. Her violence reached into the everyday details of life, leaving Saunders fearful of minor decisions. Bringing the wrong groceries home or disagreeing over small purchases could set her off. Neighbours noticed the tension, but the cycle of intimidation kept Saunders from exposing the worst of it. Behind closed doors, Catherine's rages defined the rhythm of their household. Few people considered stepping in. The culture of silence surrounding domestic issues in rural towns kept him trapped. By 1988, Saunders reached his breaking point. After a particularly violent fight where Catherine went after him with scissors, he fled the house. He tried returning briefly, hoping things would improve, but the threats soon resumed. Finally, he moved away, escaping not only her presence but also the constant lurking fear that she might one day kill him. Even at a distance, her intimidation continued. Saunders lived in apprehension that she would turn up unannounced to exact revenge for his desertion. Years later, he admitted that sense of impending danger never fully left him. Catherine's relationship with Saunders revealed something alarming. Each new partnership not only repeated earlier violent patterns, but escalated them. With David Kellett, she had strangled, attacked, and threatened. But with Saunders, she introduced targeted psychological tactics like killing his pet, a deliberate act of control far more sadistic than before. Her pattern was spiraling, and those close to her could see she was becoming more unhinged with every failed relationship. Her next long-term involvement was with John Chillingworth, another worker from the abattoir. For a brief period, he thought he had found something stable with her. By that stage, in the early 1990s, Catherine was in her mid-30s, and Chillingworth hoped she had mellowed with age. At first, things seemed steady. Together they had a child, yet once again, the stability was short-lived. Catherine's jealousy resurfaced with alarming speed. Chillingworth soon found himself enduring the same volatility that others warned about. She accused him of cheating on trivial grounds, sometimes appearing outside places he visited to keep tabs on him. Stalking behavior became part of her tactics, showing him she could appear anywhere, anytime. When that failed to keep him under her control, she resorted to attacks. He suffered physical assaults similar to her previous partners, cuts from sharp objects and blows from household weapons. Friends of Chillingworth began urging him to leave, aware of Catherine's history, but extracting oneself from her grip always carried risk. She threatened to ruin reputations, harm property, or injure those who crossed her. Eventually, after several years marked by violent confrontations, Chillingworth pulled away. While their relationship did not reach the same public depths of horror as the killing of Saunders' dog, the escalating jealousy and stalking behavior were stark reminders of her progression. Moving from partner to partner, she carried each unresolved rage with her, amplifying it in the next relationship until no one was safe. By the time she emerged from her relationship with Chillingworth, Catherine had built a chilling record. 2 former partners traumatized, 1 pet brutally killed, and a child caught in the chaos of violence. In each case, her obsessive hold, jealousy, and aggression dominated everything. What people could see by then was clear. Every time Catherine entered a relationship, violence would follow. Each man who came into her life left injured, traumatized, or permanently scarred. Yet instead of intervention stopping her, the cycle continued. And tragically, her next relationship would bring her together with John Price, a man beloved by his community, but one who would discover too late just how fatal stepping into Knight's orbit could be. When Catherine Knight began seeing John Chillingworth in the early 1990s, some around town thought perhaps things might finally settle. By then, she was in her mid-30s, with a well-known reputation for violence, but Chillingworth hoped she had matured. He was a local abattoir worker, familiar with her background, yet willing to give the relationship a chance. At first, she seemed calmer, offering affection and presenting herself as committed to building a family. They even had a child together, a son who provided a sense of grounding, but the peace was fragile, more of a mask than a change. It did not take long for old patterns to return. Catherine's jealousy began cropping up over trivial matters. If John spoke with a female co-worker or simply arrived home later than expected, he faced accusations of betrayal. These were not arguments typical of ordinary relationships. Her reactions carried a sharp volatility, swinging from sullen silence to explosive confrontation in a matter of minutes. For John, unpredictability soon became the norm. He found himself constantly managing her moods, unsure which version of Catherine he would face when opening the front door. Her jealousy was not limited to heated accusations. Catherine began following John, turning up unannounced at places he visited. Friends remember her watching from the car outside pubs, or appearing in unexpected spots, demanding explanations of where he had been. What began as suspicion developed into stalking behavior. She wanted to remind him that she could monitor his every move. For John, those moments made it clear his privacy had vanished. As her suspicion deepened, violence resurfaced. Catherine struck him during arguments, sometimes with her fists, other times grabbing household objects to inflict greater damage. Like previous partners, John faced the sharp edge of her temper in ways that made leaving risky. Though her assaults rarely left visible scars to outsiders, those close to him understood he was trapped in a frightening cycle. John also found himself isolated. Within their circle, many already knew Catherine for her violent streak. Friends and family urged him to leave, warning that staying with her could end badly. But breaking away from Catherine was never simple. She threatened reputations and dangled custody of their son as leverage. Each time John thought about departing, he encountered fresh intimidation. Catherine did not always need to use knives to control. Emotional manipulation and the threat of violence were often enough. Her aggression spilled into moments where outsiders could see glimpses of her cruelty. In public arguments, Catherine screamed accusations at John, sometimes shoving him in front of others. For those watching, it confirmed what many suspected, that her temper had not changed, only adapted to a new partner. John, who had once entered the relationship optimistically, was visibly worn down. his confidence eaten away by Catherine's constant pressure. After several years, the relationship collapsed under the weight of her behavior. The tipping point came when John realized the environment was not safe for himself or their son. While the details of their final confrontations remain less public than her earlier displays, the outcome mirrored the trajectory of all Catherine's relationships prior: control, intimidation, violence, and eventual destruction. John managed to separate from her without the kind of catastrophic violence that had marked her relationship with Saunders, but his ordeal left him wary and mistrustful. For Catherine, though, the breakup did not lead to reflection or restraint. The end of her union with John Chillingworth reinforced the same dark pattern. Men came into her life with optimism and left battered, frightened, or destroyed. Far from being chastened by another failed partnership, she seemed to carry the anger forward, letting it thicken and harden. Each chapter of abuse built upon the last, escalating in intensity and scope. By the time her relationship with Chillingworth ended, Catherine Knight had left a trail of damaged men and chaotic households across Aberdeen. Her violence was no longer just a private family matter. It was a disturbing local legend. Yet nothing had truly prevented her from continuing the cycle. When she eventually crossed paths with John Price, a man well loved in the community, many would later wonder if he had known the risks. The truth was clear. Catherine Knight had shown who she was in every relationship before him, and with each turn, the danger edged closer to the ultimate explosion of violence to come. John Charles Thomas Price, known to everyone as Pricey, was born in 1955 and spent his life in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales. By the time Catherine Knight crossed his path in the early 1992, he was a fixture in the town of Aberdeen. A respected miner with 3 children from a previous marriage, Price was well liked for his humour, his steady temperament, and his generosity. Neighbours trusted him, and friends admired him. He seemed the last man who would ever fall into Catherine's orbit. But in the mid-1992, he did. At first, the match seemed hopeful. Catherine, recently separated from John Chillingworth, knew how to present herself as devoted in the early stages. She cooked extravagant meals, showered Price with affection, and spoke with conviction about building a future together. Price, used to shouldering responsibilities on his own, welcomed her attention. His children, however, sensed something darker. Catherine's warmth was selective, and it did not extend to them. The cracks appeared quickly. Jealousy returned, sharper than ever. If Price worked late or chatted with a female co-worker, Catherine accused him of betrayal. Arguments escalated from shouting to physical violence. His daughter Veronica later described her as manipulative and frightening, warning her father that something was deeply wrong. Friends and colleagues echoed the sentiment, urging him to leave before it was too late. Price resisted their warnings. He loved his children, but he also craved companionship, and Catherine's early affection kept him tethered. When her behaviour grew unbearable, he forced her out of the house, only to let her back in weeks later after her tearful promises. The cycle of separation and reconciliation hardened into a pattern. By the late 1992, the relationship was a storm. Catherine stalked his movements, opened his mail, and clashed openly with his children. Price's friends began to notice his injuries. On one occasion, she stabbed him in the chest, leaving only a minor wound. He shrugged it off, but those close to him were alarmed. Then came 1998. Catherine demanded marriage, and Price refused. Marriage had always been her symbol of control, and his rejection infuriated her. In retaliation, she secretly filmed items he had taken years earlier from work, discarded first aid kits, destined for the trash, and handed the footage to his employer. After 17 years at the company, Price lost his job. For him, it was devastating. For Catherine, it was a weapon, punishment for his refusal. By then, Price's fear had become plain. He confided to friends that he believed Catherine would one day kill him. Still, the cycle dragged on. She threatened him, destroyed his belongings, and harassed his children. Aberdeen was not a large town, and their turmoil became public. At the pub, she screamed accusations. In the street, she hurled threats. People whispered openly that she was dangerous and that Pricey was in trouble. Despite restraining orders and repeated attempts to end things, Catherine always found her way back. His good nature, her manipulation, and the relentless cycle of abuse left him trapped. By early 2000, the tension had reached its peak. Catherine's violence was no longer behind closed doors. It was woven into the fabric of their lives. Price told his friends bluntly that he was afraid she would kill him. Everyone around him could see the truth, and still, she remained. The fuse was lit, the danger undeniable. What came next would not surprise anyone. It would only horrify them. By February of 2000, John Price's relationship with Catherine Knight was in its final, chaotic spiral. For years he had tried to manage her mood swings, physical attacks, and erratic demands, but the damage had accumulated. He had lost his job after Catherine exposed him with footage of discarded work property, suffered injuries from her assaults, and watched the peace of his home disintegrate as his children grew scared of her presence. Despite all this, she had a way of forcing her way back into his life, cycling through fury, apologies, and manipulative promises. That unstable balance shattered completely in the last weeks of his life. Price had made it clear he did not want to marry her. Marriage, to Catherine, was proof of total control. She had demanded it time and again, and his refusal ate at her. This rejection became the central wound she could not forgive. Witnesses later testified that this disagreement escalated into constant screaming matches. Catherine accused him of humiliating her, of betraying her loyalty, and of treating her as if she was not good enough. Her fixation grew as February wore on. Price, exhausted and fearing the inevitable, confided to friends that he believed she would eventually kill him. That fear was not speculation. He said it plainly at work, and to his drinking companions at the pub. "She is going to kill me one day." These were not nervous jokes or exaggerations. Those who heard his words saw the seriousness in his eyes. His children echoed the same alarm, telling him she was not safe to be around. He knew it, but Catherine's cycle of intimidation and manipulation was strong. Each time he tried to end it, she forced her way back inside, leaving him cornered. On February 29th, the final day of his life, Price finished work and stopped by the courthouse to obtain an apprehended violence order, the Australian equivalent of a restraining order, against Catherine. He served the paperwork on her that day. It should have been a final step toward freedom, but Catherine responded with fury. She interpreted the order as open betrayal, a humiliation she could not tolerate. That evening, she bought new black lingerie and prepared for what everyone would later recognize as a premeditated attack. Price returned home to his house on St. Andrew's Street. Catherine arrived not long after, dressed provocatively and carrying a hidden agenda. Despite the restraining order, she made herself welcome, as she had done so many times before. Price, knowing she was volatile, agreed to let her in. The household was strange that night. Catherine cooked dinner, tried to seduce him, and presented herself as if nothing were wrong. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual outside, but inside, tension hung over every exchange between them. For Price, exhaustion likely kept him from throwing her out. He had endured too many confrontations to summon the final push. Later that evening, the two had sex. This detail later emerged in the police investigation and became one of the most disturbing parts of the timeline. It suggested Catherine wanted to create an illusion of intimacy before her final betrayal. Afterwards, Price drifted to sleep while Catherine prepared to strike. On the surface, it seemed like another unpredictable night with her, volatile but contained. Yet Catherine was not seeking reconciliation. She had planned for this night in detail, preparing her knives and setting her intentions for murder before she even arrived. Around midnight, Catherine retrieved one of her cherished knives, part of the set she always kept close. As Price slept in bed, she stabbed him. The initial blow woke him, and chaos exploded. Price stumbled from the bedroom, bleeding heavily, trying to escape into the hallway and toward the front door. Forensic analysis later revealed he managed to reach the entrance, opening it briefly, before Catherine dragged him back inside. Neighbors later reported hearing disturbances, but at the time no one acted. In frantic desperation, Price fought to survive, but she pursued him through the house, inflicting more than 30 stab wounds. Blood evidence later showed a trail through nearly every room, marking his doomed attempt to flee. Price's final moments were a desperate struggle to reach safety and fight off her relentless attack. Forensic investigators noted defensive wounds on his arms and hands, evidence that he tried to block her strikes. Despite his strength, the sheer ferocity of the stabbing overwhelmed him. In the early hours of March 1st, John Price succumbed to his injuries and collapsed. What followed would mark this crime as one of the most horrifying in Australian history. Catherine, steady in her grim determination, transitioned from murder to mutilation. She skinned Price's body with chilling precision, the skill sharpened by her years of work at the abattoir. Detectives later confirmed she removed nearly the entire hide in one complete piece, starting from below his hairline and peeling downward in a process that required patience and expertise. The act was so methodical, it stunned even trained pathologists. After this grotesque mutilation, she hung his skin on a hook in the living room. The crime escalated further, with evidence of cannibalistic preparation. Catherine decapitated him and placed his head in a cooking pot, simmering it alongside vegetables. She arranged 2 full dinner plates at the table, each labelled with the names of Price's children. To investigators, this staging was not random. It was symbolic cruelty, a plan to terrorize his family even in his death. One plate was later found tossed on the lawn, as though she changed her mind about carrying out that part of the act. But the intention was undeniable. She wanted to inflict horror not only on Price, but on those who loved him. After preparing this gruesome scene, she attempted to stage her own death. Catherine took a large quantity of pills, lying down in the home as Price's body lay butchered nearby. By the time police discovered the house the next morning, she was alive but unconscious, her suicide attempt having failed. Officers arriving on scene walked into a nightmare unlike anything they had encountered. The blood, the mutilation, the dinner table. It was evidence of violence pushed to the furthest extreme. The timeline police reconstructed later showed this was not a crime of sudden temper. It had taken shape deliberately over days, fueled by the rejection of marriage, the restraining order, and years of escalating violence. Catherine had prepared herself mentally and physically for the act, choosing the night carefully, ensuring her knives were ready, and executing each stage in sequence. For prosecutors later, this demonstrated planning, premeditation, that made clear her intent to kill. Price himself had sensed the danger, but could not escape. Tragically, his warnings to friends that she would kill him were fulfilled exactly as he feared. His decision to let her inside, made perhaps out of resignation, habit, or misplaced trust that the night might pass without incident, became the fatal allowance that sealed his fate. Every sign had pointed toward catastrophe, but intervention never came. By the end of February 2000, Catherine Knight's pattern of escalating violence had reached its horrifying climax. The morning of March 1st, 2000, began with silence around John Price's home in Aberdeen. Price had not shown up to work, and it unsettled his colleagues. He was known as reliable, the sort of man who would never casually miss a shift. Calls to his phone went unanswered, and by mid-morning, police were dispatched to check on him. On arrival, they found his car still parked outside and curtains drawn. Neighbours stood on the street, whispering nervously. Something felt wrong. When officers forced their way inside, the first thing that struck them was the smell. Even before they saw the blood, the heavy, metallic odour filled the air. As their eyes adjusted in the dim light, the scene came into focus. Blood spattered walls, soaked carpets, and streaked across almost every room. The trail told a story of struggle, of a man moving desperately through his home trying to fight his way free, only to meet constant violence at each turn. For officers used to scenes of homicide, what they were about to witness was still beyond comprehension. In the bedroom, Price's body lay beneath bloodied sheets. At first glance, it seemed simple murder, brutal but within the expected boundaries of homicide. Then investigators saw the mutilation. Much of his skin was gone, peeled away in a manner so precise it appeared surgical. When they looked to the living room, it became undeniably clear Catherine Knight had skinned him almost entirely intact, hanging his hide on a meat hook behind the archway. The shock was immediate. Seasoned detectives staggered back from the scene, some leaving the house to regain composure. The horror did not end there. In the kitchen, pots sat on the stove, simmering. Inside one, detectives found Price's decapitated head, slowly stewing with vegetables. Other pots contained cooked sections of flesh. On the dining table, 2 plates had been carefully set, meat portions arranged beside baked potato, pumpkin, zucchini, and gravy. Next to each plate was a handwritten note with the names of Price's children. Catherine had prepared to serve his remains as a grotesque meal for them. The discovery pushed officers beyond what they were prepared for. Later testimony from the first responders described the kitchen scene as something they could never erase from memory. One officer, hardened by 2 decades of police duty, later said it was the only scene that haunted him daily. The sheer deliberation, cooking the flesh, organizing the table, writing their names, revealed not frenzied madness but cruel, intentional staging. It was not just murder, it was psychological torture carried on posthumously. Knight herself lay unconscious in the house. She had taken a heavy combination of sleeping pills in what appeared to be an attempted suicide. Sprawled on the bed, she looked almost peaceful, her body unharmed despite the nightmare around her. Officers quickly secured the scene and rushed her to the hospital, where her stomach was pumped. She survived. The juxtaposition was jarring, the perpetrator resting quietly, while the crime she committed swallowed the town in horror. Forensic teams spent hours collecting evidence. Blood patterns on walls traced Price's desperate attempts to escape. In the hallway, handprints smeared in crimson told of him trying to steady himself as he collapsed again and again. The open front door, streaked with blood, confirmed he had nearly made it outside before being dragged back in. Investigators pieced together how long the ordeal lasted. Price lived for some time after the first wounds, fighting desperately, enduring dozens of stabbing blows before finally succumbing. The sheer violence was matched only by the gruesome aftermath. The skinning, done with near-professional efficiency, stunned pathologists. Her years in the abattoir had given her both the skill and stomach for the task. This was not clumsy mutilation, but chillingly exact, suggesting patience and focus. The cooking and table setting compounded the message cruelty. Experts later suggested it symbolized revenge on Price by extending horror to his children, forcing them, in a symbolic sense, to consume him. News of the discovery spread quickly through Aberdeen. Word of a murder was shocking enough for a small mining town, but as details emerged, the community struggled to believe what they were hearing. People who had worked alongside Catherine Knight, who had spoken with her at the pub, now learned she had boiled a man's head and staged a cannibalistic dinner. Friends of Price, already reeling from his death, were forced to latch onto the thought of what she intended for his children. The collective trauma sank deep into the town almost instantly. Media descended on Aberdeen in force. Headlines branded the case Australia's most gruesome killing. True crime journalists and national outlets relayed each emerging detail, often with disbelief. As reports of cooking flesh and the skinned body hit front pages, the public response bordered on horror and fascination. How could a partner, someone trusted in Price's home, do this? Commentators debated mental illness, demonic cruelty, or sheer possession. The fact that Catherine was a woman also drew attention, defying assumptions most people carried about violence of this magnitude. Back at the scene, detectives sifted through Catherine's belongings to understand her mindset. They found bloodied knives she had used for the attack, neatly cleaned of some residue, suggesting she attempted to stage the aftermath deliberately. Her suicide note was also collected. In it, she raged against Price's children for taking sides in their disputes, placing blame onto them and leaving a written testament of her anger. The note matched perfectly with her dinner table presentation, her fixation on punishing his family even after his death. In the days that followed, as Catherine was treated in hospital under police guard, investigators pieced together the final hours. They concluded she had waited until Price was asleep before striking. Her attack was frenzied but calculated. After killing him, she proceeded with mutilation, setting her stage in the early hours of the morning. Around dawn, she swallowed the pills, either to escape the consequences or to stage her own departure. The timeline revealed chilling clarity. Each stage methodical, each act rooted in months, even years, of escalating rage. The aftermath rippled well beyond Aberdeen. National conversations erupted around domestic violence, around the missed signals in Price's cries for help, and around Catherine's long history of violence toward partners left unchecked. People asked how she had avoided serious criminal sanction before this. Friends recalled urging Price to stay away, his co-workers noting his repeated warnings that she would kill him. Every detail that surfaced felt like another missed chance to prevent the eventual tragedy. Price's children bore the heaviest burden. Instead of living only with the grief of losing their father, they carried the knowledge of what Catherine had planned for them. Though the meal never reached their mouths, the psychological scar of knowing she had set that table for them became a lifelong wound. Their names written beside plates of flesh turned them into central figures of the crime, even though they were not present. That cruelty lingered, long after court dates and headlines faded. For the police, this was one of the darkest cases in memory. Some officers left the force soon after, unable to reconcile with what they had witnessed. Others needed years of counselling. The photographs of the crime scene were considered so disturbing that even in court, they were shown sparingly, judges limiting exposure to protect jurors. One investigator later said simply, "You cannot train for something like this." By the time Catherine awoke in hospital under arrest, the aftermath of her crime had already transformed her into the most notorious female murderer in Australian history. The crime scene on St Andrew Street was not just evidence of one killing. It was the culmination of decades of unchecked violence, ending in a spectacle so grotesque, it forced the entire nation to reckon with the darkest corners of human behaviour. When Catherine Knight awoke in the hospital days after the murder, she was under immediate police guard. Her attempted overdose had failed, and she was confronted with the enormity of what she had done. Detectives were firm. She was the prime suspect in John Price's brutal killing. In the weeks that followed, doctors stabilised her physically, while police collected their evidence. There was no question she had committed the crime. The blood trail, the knives, the stage table, and her presence in the house tied everything together. But her case would test Australia's justice system, drawing unprecedented public interest. From the beginning, Catherine denied responsibility. At first, she claimed to have no memory of the events. She told police she could not recall killing John Price, skinning him, or cooking parts of his body. This selective amnesia became a theme of her defense later, with her lawyers arguing that the overdose and the trauma of the night had erased memory. Investigators, however, were not convinced. They had physical proof of painstaking actions that required clarity and time: skinning, cooking, and note writing. To them, it was not a blackout but a chillingly deliberate sequence of acts. The prosecution built its case with methodical precision. They laid out the pattern of years-long violence, highlighting Catherine's reputation for knife attacks, threats, and psychological terror in previous relationships. Witnesses were called to recount her rages, her cruelty, and Price's repeated declarations that she would kill him. Forensic experts described the nature of the wounds, the chase through the house, and the expertise used in the skinning. They emphasized her training at the abattoir, arguing that her learned skill translated directly into this murder. Meanwhile, the defense attempted to shift the focus toward mental health. They argued Catherine was suffering from dissociation or psychosis at the time of the killing. Psychiatrists assessed her repeatedly, diagnosing personality disorders including borderline traits and narcissistic tendencies, but none concluded she was legally insane. She knew what she was doing. She had prepared the scene, staged elements afterward, and even attempted to escape culpability by overdosing. Ultimately, her mental health struggles did not absolve her of responsibility. Outside court, media coverage was relentless. Every new detail of her actions filled newspapers and nightly broadcasts. The idea of a woman committing such extreme violence intrigued and horrified the public simultaneously. Questions of female aggression, domestic violence, and mental illness became topics of national debate. Commentators described her as the most violent woman in Australian history, and communities grappled with the stigma of her background in Aberdeen. Jurors were shown limited crime scene photographs, only those absolutely necessary. Many of the more graphic images were withheld, deemed too disturbing. Even so, what they saw was enough to lay out the terror of Price's death. Witnesses described finding the plates set for his children. The jury heard about the notes she had written, filled with rage against Price and his family. Those details painted a picture of cold cruelty more compelling than any photograph. In October 2001, as the trial began in the New South Wales Supreme Court, Catherine initially pleaded not guilty, but as proceedings unfolded, with overwhelming evidence stacked against her, her lawyers suddenly changed her plea to guilty. The shift stunned observers. Some speculated it was to avoid further exposure of photographic evidence. Others believed Catherine wanted to control the outcome, preventing witness testimony from painting her in even darker colours. Regardless, the guilty plea meant there would be no contest over her responsibility for Price's murder. Even with the plea, a sentencing hearing was necessary. Victim impact statements from Price's children and friends underlined the devastation she had caused. His daughter expressed profound grief, describing the torment of knowing her father died brutally and that Catherine had staged a grotesque dinner in her name. For the judge and public alike, the cruelty extended beyond Price's death. It was the psychological targeting of his children that marked the crime as uniquely brutal. Justice Barry O'Keefe presided over the sentencing. He described her actions as appalling in the extreme, noting the deliberate, calculated, and revolting nature of the crime. On November 8, 2001, Catherine Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the words of the judge, her crime was so horrific that she should never be released. For the first time in Australian history, a woman received that ultimate penalty. The decision reverberated across the country. Supporters of the ruling saw it as the only appropriate response to such barbarity. Critics raised concerns about her mental health and whether the system had failed to intervene earlier, but unanimity existed on one point. Catherine Knight could never walk free again. Her name entered legal history. Her sentence a marker of how society responded to unprecedented violence. Knight showed no sign of remorse during the sentencing. She sat largely emotionless, avoiding direct acknowledgement of the pain she caused. To many observers, this absence of visible regret reinforced the chilling narrative of her life. A woman consumed by possessiveness, violence, and cruelty, incapable of empathy even at her final judgment. For John Price's family, the sentence was a measure of justice but also a permanent reminder. No legal ruling could undo the trauma of his loss or the horrifying details of how he was killed. His children grew up carrying not just grief, but the vivid knowledge of how their father died and what had nearly been done to them. Their testimonies continued to highlight domestic violence as a danger far too often minimized until tragedy occurs. The trial closed one chapter, but opened many broader conversations. Domestic violence advocates used the case as evidence of systemic failures, pointing to the signs ignored for years. Price's repeated cries for help, his restraining order, and the wide community knowledge of Catherine's violence all failed to prevent his death. The case underscored the critical importance of intervention, of treating threats and patterns of abuse as serious precursors to lethal violence. Inside prison, Catherine adjusted to her new reality. She became one of the country's most infamous inmates, serving her life sentence at Silverwater Women's Correctional Center before later moving to other high-security facilities. Guards described her as demanding, manipulative, and still prone to violent outbursts. Over time, she maintained her notoriety. Books, documentaries, and countless articles carried her story forward, yet the legal result remained firm. Life without parole meant she would die behind bars. The ripple effects of her sentencing extended into legal and cultural spheres. Law students studied the trial as a landmark, criminologists examined her psychology, and true crime communities debated every aspect of her life. The sentence became symbolic, signalling that even without precedent, Australia's courts were willing to impose the harshest penalty when crimes defied comprehension. In the end, Catherine Knight's trial and sentencing encapsulated more than just one brutal act. It represented the culmination of decades of violence unaddressed, the failure to heed warning signs, and the justice system's ultimate declaration that she could never return to society. To this day, she remains the only woman in Australia serving life without parole. Her name is synonymous with cruelty, obsession, and the darkest extremes of domestic violence. Catherine Knight's crime did not just horrify, it left experts grappling with the question of why. How does someone progress from violent partner to calculated murderer who stages such grotesque displays? Psychiatrists, criminologists, and legal experts have studied her case for more than 2 decades, trying to piece together a profile that could explain the extremes of her behavior. The foundation of her psychology lay in instability. Assessments after her arrest pointed toward borderline personality disorder traits, patterns of intense and unstable relationships, mood swings, fear of abandonment, and explosive anger. These traits aligned closely with her history: the possessive grip on each partner, the cycle of adoration followed by violent explosions, and her inability to let relationships end peacefully. Partners described her as someone who would rather destroy everything than be left behind. Psychologists also found evidence of narcissistic tendencies. Catherine sought control and dominance, not just affection. She demanded loyalty in ways that were absolute, and when denied, she retaliated with force. This explained why John Price's refusal to marry her became the ultimate insult. In her worldview, rejection was not just personal disappointment. It was an attack on her identity she had to punish. Rather than walking away, she escalated to obliteration. Another striking pattern was her sadism. Violence to Catherine was not only reactionary. At times, it appeared purposeful. Killing David Saunders' puppy was a clear example, designed not out of blind rage but as a demonstration of control, a psychological weapon to instill fear. The staging of Price's body and the dinner for his children fit that same pattern. These were acts aimed at tormenting others, extending cruelty beyond the victim. Her crime was not simply about death. It was about sending a message of domination from beyond the grave. What made her uniquely dangerous was the combination of traits. Many people suffer from personality disorders. Very few commit something so extreme. In Catherine's case, her environment amplified her worst impulses. The violence she witnessed in childhood normalized aggression. Her years in the abattoir conditioned her to feel comfortable with knives and gore. Her inability to read or write until adulthood limited healthy coping strategies, instead cementing physical outbursts as her only form of expression. These elements did not excuse the murder, but they revealed how her psychology and circumstances built a lethal storm. Professionals debated whether she understood the consequences of her behavior. Evidence suggested she did. She planned the crime, staged scenes deliberately, and attempted suicide afterward to avoid accountability. Those actions showed foresight and awareness. While her lawyers argued about dissociation or amnesia, experts concluded Catherine was not psychotic. She knew what she was doing, even if her emotions pushed her toward extremes. This is what made her so terrifying. She combined volatile rage with moments of calculated clarity. The case also raised questions about predictability. Catherine's history of domestic violence was extensive, spanning decades and multiple partners. Each relationship ended in escalating assaults, police involvement, or hospitalizations. Saunders, Chillingworth, and Price all showed visible fear, and friends consistently warned that she was dangerous. Yet intervention never stopped her. In hindsight, many saw her eventual crime as inevitable. But could anyone have predicted cannibalistic staging? That question haunts criminologists to this day. For domestic violence advocates, Knight's case highlights systemic blind spots. Authorities often dismissed or minimized violence in relationships, especially when the aggressor was female. Society rarely frames women as lethal threats, which gave Catherine space to keep escalating. If her partners had been female victims of a violent man, perhaps intervention would have come earlier. Instead, her abuse was allowed to unfold across years, culminating in the worst-case scenario. Her profile also forced Australians to reconsider assumptions about female aggression. Women commit domestic violence, but rarely with such ferocity. Historically, female homicide offenders in Australia tended toward reactions of desperation or self-defense. Catherine stood out because her crime was neither. It was not an escape from abuse. It was the creation of abuse on the grandest, most horrifying scale. Criminologists labelled her an anomaly, but also a case study in how gendered assumptions can conceal risk. One of the enduring key questions is about remorse. Throughout her trial and sentencing, Catherine displayed little acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Reports from prison indicate she continues to deny responsibility and claims no memory of the murder. This absence of regret sets her apart from offenders who reflect or express contrition. In her case, the denial seems less about genuine amnesia and more about an ongoing refusal to face what she did. For psychologists, that detachment reinforces the coldness of her character. In the years since, Catherine's profile has been dissected in universities, law schools, and criminology programs. Her name surfaces in discussions of the most severe domestic homicide cases worldwide. Students study her as an example of how violent tendencies manifest in women, how escalation can follow a predictable path, and how psychology interacts with culture and gender expectations. Yet despite all the analysis, no profile fully answers the central question: why did she go so far? Violence in relationships is tragically common, but cannibalistic staging remains nearly unique. Some experts argue it was symbolic revenge, forcing her victim's family to suffer forever. Others interpret it as the ultimate assertion of control, ensuring she owned not just John Price's life, but his memory. Whatever the motivation, it was a crime that exposed the limits of psychological explanation, reminding us that some acts remain outside what careful profiling can contain. In the end, Catherine Knight's psychology reflects a life warped by violence, dominated by control, and devoid of empathy. Her story underscores the importance of recognizing warning signs, believing victims, and treating threats as real, regardless of the perpetrator's gender. The key question, how far can unchecked violence escalate, was answered on March 1st, 2000. The haunting reality is that John Price saw it coming, but still could not escape. When Catherine Knight was sentenced to life without parole in 2001, the gavel did not just close the chapter on John Price's murder. It rippled out through Aberdeen, through psychology faculties, and through the wider Australian public, leaving scars that linger to this day. In the years since, her name has become shorthand for the extremes of domestic violence, a reminder of how unchecked brutality can turn into an unimaginable tragedy. Aberdeen itself never fully recovered. This quiet community, known for mining and abattoir work, had never been on the front page of national papers. Suddenly, it was infamous worldwide for hosting Australia's most grotesque crime scene. Residents who had gone to school with Catherine, shared pub conversations, or simply seen her walking Main Street Live with the uneasy knowledge of proximity. They had not known they were brushing shoulders with someone capable of staging cannibalistic horror in her own home. That collective shock etched itself into the town's identity. Even years later, people lowered their voices when her name was mentioned, as though saying it out loud gave life to the darkness that had once torn through their streets. On a broader scale, criminologists and legal scholars dissected the case intensely. For many, Catherine Knight represents a breakthrough in understanding female-perpetrated domestic violence. Until then, discussions often placed women in the role of victim or, at most, reactive offender. Knight presented something different: premeditated, sadistic, and sustained violence against partners over decades. Her gender, far from softening reaction, amplified the terror. The fact that a woman could cut so deeply against social expectations fueled international studies, lectures, and books. She became an academic case study in the rare overlap between female offenders and extreme sadism. The law also marked her case as precedent. Her life sentence without parole was the first ever handed to a woman in Australia. That ruling established firmly that legal penalties for brutality know no gendered boundaries. It told the public that no matter the circumstances or identity of the offender, the legal system was willing to impose the harshest outcome when crimes defied comprehension. Even now, courtrooms cite her case when considering sentencing severity for violent offenders. For John Price's family, however, the legacy is not historical. It is personal. His children still carry the dual trauma of losing their father and knowing what Catherine prepared for them. Their names, etched on table notes beside plates of flesh, remain among the most haunting details of modern Australian crime. Friends of Price speak of the injustice of missed opportunities, the restraining orders not enforced, the warnings not heeded. The tragedy remains a warning that intervention needs to be more than paperwork. It requires acting decisively before threats become headlines. Within prisons, Catherine remains notorious. Fellow inmates speak of her reputation, half in fear, half in disgust. Guards view her as manipulative, sometimes dangerous, even behind bars. Over more than 2 decades, she has not faded from infamy. Books, documentaries, and television specials continually revive her story. She has become a permanent feature in Australia's cultural memory of crime, mentioned in the same breath as the nation's most infamous offenders. For criminologists, she is a case study. For the public, a horror story. For Aberdeen, a wound. The case also helped push domestic violence further into the national dialogue. Advocates used it to highlight the risks of ignoring long-term abuse patterns. Price had spoken of his fears many times, and his community echoed the danger. Yet tangible protective measures failed to keep Catherine away. It forced Australians to confront an uncomfortable truth. Possessing a restraining order is not protection when enforcement lags and abusers go unchecked. Police and policymakers faced calls to improve domestic violence response, to believe victims, and to treat female offenders as seriously as male ones. Internationally, Catherine Knight became one of those rare names recognised even outside her country. True crime researchers across the world cite her case right beside infamous American and British killers. What captivated attention was the fusion of domestic setting with extraordinary brutality. John Price was not a stranger in an alley. He was her partner, in his own home, betrayed in the most intimate setting imaginable. That merging of domestic familiarity with grotesque violence became symbolic of how danger often hides behind closed doors, framed as just relationship issues until it is too late. Over more than 2 decades later, her legacy collides with larger systemic questions. Could Catherine Knight have been stopped? Were there points when intervention by authorities, friends, or medical care could have blunted her violent path? The answer is yes, but those opportunities were missed, each failure permitting escalation. In that sense, her name is not just infamous, it is instructive. It is used in training, in advocacy, in campaigns reminding society to listen when victims say they are scared. And still, Catherine lives, confined to a cell, growing older behind secure gates. She has not shown remorse or taken responsibility. To this day, she claims memory loss, denying ownership of what evidence so clearly demonstrates. This absence of contrition leaves a strange final note on her legacy. For some offenders, later years bring reflection, admissions of guilt, and efforts to reconcile. For Catherine, silence and denial have replaced confession. The horror she inflicted resides not only in the actions of one night, but in her enduring refusal to face them. The legacy of Catherine Knight stretches beyond law, psychology, or crime coverage. It rests in the fractured lives of those who loved John Price, in the anxiety of neighbours who recall normal chats with a future killer, and in the lessons every domestic violence advocate demands society remember. Violence ignored is violence emboldened. Patterns left unchecked can build toward catastrophe. The horror of March 2000 is not only about the grotesque aftermath, it is about how preventable it might have been if warnings had been taken seriously. Hi again. Please like the video and comment down below where you are listening from and what time is currently. Let's get to it. The morning air over southern New Mexico was already hot when a passing driver spotted movement on the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be an injured animal, but as he slowed, he saw a woman, barefoot and half naked, a metal chain dragging at her wrist as she stumbled through the dust. Her face was caked with blood and dry tears, her breath ragged. She waved frantically, choking on the words, "Help me, please." That woman was 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil. In a few seconds, She crossed from private nightmare to public evidence of one of the most horrifying crimes ever uncovered in the American Southwest. The motorist brought her to safety at a nearby mobile home, where neighbors locked the door and dialed the police. Officers arrived to find her trembling, chained, and terrified. Between gasps, she pointed back toward Elephant Butte Lake. "He's got other women," she said. "He's going to kill them." Her voice shook as she tried to explain who he was. A man calling himself David. She said there was a woman helping him named Cindy. The officers wrote the information down, not yet understanding the scale of what they were about to uncover. When investigators traced Vigil's description to a property near Elephant Butte, they expected to find a kidnapper's den. What they found was closer to an engineered nightmare. Inside a double-length trailer parked behind Ray's modest home sat what he called his toy box. It was built with surgical precision, walls lined in stainless steel, ceiling hooks fitted with pulleys, a padded operating table bolted to the floor. Nearby, police found cameras, ropes, medical instruments, clamps, and a large collection of tapes and written notes. Everything inside pointed to a system, an organized design for prolonged captivity. The soundproofing was so complete that neighbors never heard a sound. Even with the door closed, voices inside disappeared into silence. Investigators said the air in the trailer felt stale, like a place cut off from the world. On one counter, they found a cassette ready to play. Out of morbid duty, one of the technicians pressed play. A man's voice came through the speakers, calm, flat, rehearsed, welcoming a new prisoner and explaining what would happen to her. That voice belonged to David Parker Ray. It was a meticulously recorded monologue, designed to destroy hope before torment even began. He called it his introduction. In it, he described in graphic detail the rules of captivity and the punishments for resistance. He told victims that everything was determined, that escape was impossible. For investigators standing inside the small trailer, the implications were overwhelming. How long had this chamber been used? How many victims entered and never left? Within hours, the small police department of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, realized the magnitude of the case exceeded their capacity. They called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation and State Police. The scene was secured, photographs taken, and evidence catalogued. Behind the locked door of that trailer, officers found whips, gags, syringes, and carefully labeled diagrams showing restraint positions. There were mirrors mounted at angles suggesting voyeuristic intent. Every tool had a purpose. Every surface was scrubbed clean. The press would later call Ray the toy box killer, borrowing from the name he had given his own trailer. But in that moment, labels meant little. The first responders who entered the chamber described feeling disoriented. One compared it to stepping into a surgical lab designed for pain. Experienced officers turned pale and stepped away. Some vomited after leaving the scene. None of them could reconcile the contrast between the horror inside and the quiet desert community around them. In a later interview, one investigator said, "It was not chaos, it was precision. Every inch of that space told you he planned this for years." They collected hundreds of items. Many were custom-made, suggesting engineering skills and long-term preparation. Among the files recovered were diaries, hinting at dozens of victims stretching back years, most never identified. In police custody, Cynthia Vigil slowly began to fill the gaps. Her account was fragmented by trauma, but consistent enough to map what she survived. She said Ray had kidnapped her under the pretense of hiring her for work. Instead, she was drugged, chained, and taken to the trailer. There, she woke to the recorded welcome message. She remembered hearing the man's voice explaining that she was now property and must obey. For 3 days, she endured physical and psychological abuse before a mistake set her free. The immediate stakes were clear. If Vigil told the truth, there could be more women trapped or already buried in the desert. Time mattered. Officers worked around the clock to process the property, search nearby terrain, and interrogate anyone connected to Ray. The discovery also exposed deep social fault lines. Many of Ray's suspected victims were sex workers, runaways, or women with addiction histories, groups often dismissed when they disappeared. That neglect now looked like the perfect camouflage for a serial predator. Reporters descended on Truth or Consequences within days. Locals watched their quiet retirement town transform into the center of national attention. Residents who remembered Ray as a polite mechanic struggled to believe it was the same man leading nightly newscasts. But as new evidence surfaced, photographs, names, and phone call logs, the narrative hardened. This was not a single crime. It was a long-running operation, hidden in plain sight. Authorities tried to retrace Ray's steps. They found that he kept meticulous notes about his machinery but vague entries about people, almost as if their lives were inventory rather than individuals. The timeline hinted that he had been active since at least the early 1990s. Some investigators suspected much earlier. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the complexity of the case required a multi-agency task force. Specialists in profiling and forensics joined the effort. A preliminary psychological assessment described a personality obsessed with control, deriving pleasure from domination more than from killing itself. He treated his crimes like experiments, methodical and repeatable. Meanwhile, the broader public faced the deeply unsettling question: how had he operated for so long without detection? Truth or Consequences had barely 5,000 residents. People knew each other by name. Yet behind one man's locked trailer was a secret that made even seasoned detectives hesitate to enter. The investigation's first phase unfolded rapidly, but understanding its depth would take years. Cynthia Vigil's escape marked only the beginning. The evidence inside the toy box forced law enforcement to piece together a history that stretched back decades. Each artifact hinted at unseen victims and unsolved disappearances across New Mexico, Arizona, and possibly Texas. By week's end, the case file filled with statements, photographs, and psychological evaluations. The story drew national horror because it touched on primal fears: being trapped, silenced, erased. But for investigators, the most haunting realization came not from what they found, but from what they could not. There were tools that suggested the use of recording equipment, yet most tapes were missing. There were personal items clearly belonging to others, with no identities to match them. As night fell over Elephant Butte Lake, the trailer sat sealed behind blue tape. Flashing lights reflected off the metal siding. Officers spoke quietly, some shaking their heads. Inside, evidence markers glowed under harsh lighting, each note marking the intersection of suffering and secrecy. To understand who could have built such a place, and why, it was necessary to go back to Belen, New Mexico. Decades earlier, where a boy named David Parker Ray began developing the compulsions that would one day lead to the toy box. To explain the discovery, we have to learn how that boy became a man capable of designing horror by hand. David Parker Ray grew up far from the desert lakes where his crimes would later unfold. He was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, a modest railway town southwest of Albuquerque. The streets were quiet, and families knew each other by sight, but behind closed doors, his early life was marked by instability. His father, Cecil Ray, was a strict, often violent man who drank heavily and disciplined his children with cruelty that blurred into abuse. His mother worked long hours and was rarely home. Neighbors later described the Ray family as withdrawn and stern, the kind of household where children were kept quiet, not comforted. When David was 10, his parents separated. His father disappeared from his daily life, but continued to visit occasionally, bringing not gifts, but pornographic magazines and explicit photographs. Those images became part of David's foundation, a disturbing early window into abuse tied to domination. Teachers noticed the boy was quiet, intensely polite, but easily humiliated. He rarely socialized and showed signs of anxiety when confronted or teased. At home, he had room to experiment. According to later psychological evaluations, Ray began showing cruelty toward animals in early adolescence. Neighbors recalled finding injured dogs and cats near his home, though no one ever proved it was him. One former classmate remembered hearing David boast about tying animals down and testing them. When questioned, he would laugh nervously and change the subject. In the 1950s, such behavior rarely triggered intervention. It was brushed off as boys being boys, but seen through a forensic lens decades later, it was an early signal, patterns of domination repeating themselves on powerless victims. His teenage years were filled with isolation. He spent hours tinkering with engines and tools in the garage. Mechanical precision fascinated him. Machines obeyed where people resisted. Friends, few as they were, said he preferred working alone. Around this time, his interest in pornography grew more extreme. He drew crude sketches of bondage scenes, collecting and modifying them with mechanical notes in the margins, gears, pulleys, clamps. To outsiders, it looked like engineering practice. In hindsight, it was something darker, the beginning of design thinking applied to control. Ray's teachers described him as intelligent but disengaged. He graduated without distinction and enlisted in the United States Army shortly after turning 18. The military gave him structure and a trade, mechanical maintenance. He learned how to operate precise systems, calibrate instruments, and manage complex machinery. Those technical skills would later become crucial to his crimes. The army also gave him his first exposure to authority that demanded absolute obedience, reinforcing a worldview already shaped by dominance and submission. While stationed in various locations, he had brief relationships with women. Several reported that he was controlling and emotionally cold. He expected compliance in every detail and reacted unpredictably to defiance. Nothing overtly criminal was documented at that stage, but the pattern was clear. Affection was replaced by order. By the time he returned to New Mexico in the mid-1960s, he had several failed marriages behind him and a growing inability to connect emotionally with others. Ray took work as a mechanic, both for local employers and the State Park Service. Colleagues described him as skilled, punctual, and quietly distant. He was the man who could fix anything mechanical but rarely joined conversations. Beneath that professionalism, he maintained an elaborate private life, developing fantasies that revolved around kidnapping and abuse. Around this period, he began keeping diaries. Early entries were technical, but they gradually evolved into monologues exploring imagined acts of torture. He did not write in the tone of a sadist, reveling in chaos. He wrote like an engineer, documenting procedure. Investigators later said those diaries read more like user manuals than confessions, detached, systematic, focused on efficiency and control. Mental health experts who reviewed them described an obsessive-compulsive pattern aimed at perfection of method. He viewed human suffering as a mechanism to be refined. His lack of empathy was not impulsive. It was measured. Ray's connection to his father remained complicated. There were sporadic reunions, but the elder Ray's influence left lasting marks. Exposure to dominance framed as masculinity shaped David's concept of intimacy. Violence and power became entwined. As adulthood progressed, Ray's relationships followed predictable arcs: charm, control, escalation, withdrawal. When partners expressed fear or tried to leave, he turned detached, dismissing their reactions as weakness. Some later mentioned he kept tools that did not seem relevant to regular mechanic work: restraints, chains, surgical clamps. None suspected his intentions. Assuming they related to his tinkering hobby, he also began constructing small private spaces, sheds, workstations, trailers, where he could modify equipment. He would build handmade devices intended to immobilize or bind. Co-workers occasionally helped him weld or machine parts without asking their purpose. To them, he was simply the quiet craftsman who liked building things. No one questioned what those things were for. Psychologists later suggested that during this period, Ray's fantasy life overtook his external one. Instead of venting or diminishing over time, his dark imagination became his main outlet. He sought materials, books, stored images, sometimes hand-drawn manuals that mirrored his interests. For years, he practiced secrecy as a lifestyle, keeping one face for the town and another locked away. This duplicity became so habitual that deceit no longer registered as deception. It was simply maintenance of the world he needed to function. Records show that by the late 1970s, Ray owned a series of small properties around the Elephant Butte area. Each had private workshops. Those locations would later be key to reconstructing his path toward the toy box. Yet at the time, no one connected the dots. Local law enforcement only knew him as a reliable state employee, involved in minor infractions, but nothing serious. The line between hobby and pathology remained unseen because Ray lived methodically within the bounds of normal life. When decades later, investigators traced his story backward, they struggled to locate a single dramatic trigger. His descent was not sudden. It grew like corrosion, slow, internal, masked by competence. From neglected childhood to disciplined soldier to respectable worker, each stage added another layer of concealment. By his mid-50s, David Parker Ray had perfected anonymity. He lived alone near the lake, surrounded by tools and gadgets, trusted enough to have keys to several maintenance facilities. Neighbors thought he was harmless, maybe a bit eccentric. They could not see the meticulous records he kept at home or the fantasies expanding from notebook sketches into tangible plans. The man who would one day terrify investigators had been forming that identity for decades. His upbringing taught obedience through pain. The army taught him precision. Solitude taught him secrecy. Those elements fused into a psychology where people were mere mechanisms to be manipulated. By the time Cynthia Vigil stumbled from his trailer in 1999, the evolution of David Parker Ray was complete. A quiet boy from Belen, grown into a man whose cruelty was engineered over a lifetime. To the outside world, David Parker Ray looked ordinary. In the early 1990s, he lived in a trailer near Elephant Butte Lake, where retirees, fishermen, and tourists shared space with locals who relied on the recreation economy. Ray worked for the State Park Service, maintaining boats, engines, and utility systems. Colleagues described him as dependable, quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself but never caused trouble. When something mechanical broke, people turned to him. That reliability built trust, the kind that would later hide something far darker. He was not the kind of neighbor who drew attention. He waved in passing, helped fix small problems, and spent evenings tinkering alone. Friends said he liked old cars, country music, and solitude. Nothing about him suggested violence. Yet, behind the small talk, he was building a hidden domain, a place where his private fantasies could exist without interruption. The trailer he kept behind his house looked like any other work shed from the outside. Over time, he reinforced its walls, added insulation, and installed multiple locks. He bought surgical equipment through mail-order catalogs and collected materials from junkyards and surplus sales. Piece by piece, he transformed the space into a soundproof prison. The process took years. Each modification represented the merging of his technical ability with his desire for control. Meanwhile, his social circle narrowed to those who could serve his purpose. His daughter, Jessie Ray, had grown up in the shadow of his dual personality. She had seen glimpses of equipment and unsettling behavior, but did not fully grasp the extent of his interests. As she reached adulthood, her relationship with him blurred the line between loyalty and fear. Investigators later learned that Jessie introduced acquaintances to him, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what those meetings sometimes became. Then came Cindy Hendy. She entered Ray's life after moving from Washington State to escape her own criminal troubles. Rough-edged and outspoken, she became both his companion and accomplice. Within months, she knew about the trailer. He presented it not as a threat, but as a secret world where his needs could be met safely. Hendy later claimed that she accepted it because it offered her power she had never had. Together, they became a closed system. He supplied the method. She provided the access. To outsiders in Truth or Consequences, they were an odd but unremarkable couple. They shopped for groceries, attended local events, and even invited acquaintances over for drinks. No one saw anything amiss. What visitors could not know was that just yards away, inside a fortified trailer, Ray's private fantasies were becoming physical reality. Throughout the early 1990s, disappearances trickled across the region. Women involved in sex work, hitchhikers, and those struggling with addiction. Many were last seen in Albuquerque, Socorro, or near Elephant Butte. Most were not reported missing immediately, and those who were seldom generated sustained investigations. Police viewed these cases as transient disappearances, not homicides. That blind spot became Ray's security blanket. He studied patterns, identifying who could vanish without question. His journal entries from this period revealed a methodical escalation, lists of names, coded locations, and notes about restraint designs. Investigators later described reading them as entering a parallel dimension, a structured bureaucracy of cruelty operating unnoticed in a community of retirees and fishermen. Neighbors occasionally heard mechanical sounds late at night, but assumed he was working on engines. When Ray bought building materials, hardware store clerks thought he was doing routine repairs. Even the smell of chemicals from his property, likely cleaning agents, did not alarm anyone. He was a state employee. His presence implied legitimacy. There was, however, a small group of locals who found him unnerving. They recalled how his demeanor changed when women entered a room, how he watched too long, spoke too softly. Some dismissed it as social awkwardness. Others quietly avoided him. But within that tolerance lay his freedom. Elephant Butte's slow pace and transient visitors meant few consistent witnesses. If a woman vanished, she was often assumed to have moved on, not disappeared forever. Cindy Hendy later told investigators that Ray viewed his crimes as projects. He kept schedules, prepared tools days in advance, and recorded details after each act. He described the results in objective scientific language. This precision allowed him to compartmentalize the abuse from his daily life. To finish a shift repairing boat motors, then return home and test new restraints, felt normal to him. His reputation among co-workers stayed intact. They saw a hard-working, mechanically minded man nearing retirement age. Some joked about his secrecy, calling him MacGyver. No one guessed he was the subject of missing person reports scattered across counties. For every new case listing a missing woman, Ray adjusted his routine, driving at night, disposing of evidence far from town, and using drugs to erase memory in survivors. The notion that someone in their midst could be systematically kidnapping and torturing women did not fit the town's self-image. Truth or Consequences was small enough that gossip travelled fast, yet no consistent rumour ever formed. Ray's victims were carefully chosen outsiders, women seldom connected to anyone with influence. When one failed to show up again, there were few who went looking. Over the years, his toy box grew more sophisticated. He integrated electrical systems, specialized lighting, and secure restraints built from salvaged machinery. On one wall, he installed a mirror angled toward the central table. The setup suggested both control and surveillance, a captive forced to see what was happening. It was not chaos, but industrial design serving depravity. Ray's ability to blend mundane life with premeditated brutality mystified investigators later. They found the contrast hard to reconcile. His work references praised his professionalism. His property held schematics for torment. A former supervisor described him as methodical and gentle with equipment, recalling, "I never even heard him raise his voice." That calm exterior was camouflage perfected over years. Forensic psychologists reviewing the case later concluded that Ray's success depended on consistency. He avoided drugs beyond those used to subdue victims. He did not seek attention. He maintained structure because chaos threatened his control. In that, he differed from impulsive offenders. He was organized, detached, almost bureaucratic in evil, an administrator of suffering rather than a thrill-seeker. By the mid-1990s, his daughter Jessie drifted away, but remained occasionally in contact. It was through her circle that Ray sometimes found new victims, each lured under pretense of drugs, money, or temporary work. Hendy's involvement deepened. She learned how to distract, how to clean, how to dispose of items afterward. Within this partnership, she became both participant and witness, oscillating between submission to Ray and assertion of her own cruelty. Law enforcement would not connect the pattern for years. Reports of missing women remained siloed across jurisdictions. Data systems were fragmented, and transient lifestyles made tracking nearly impossible. By exploiting that fragmentation, Ray ensured invisibility. Each missing woman existed as an isolated file number, never linked to the quiet man who fixed engines by the lake. It was not luck that protected him. It was structure, routine, perception, and geography. Elephant Butte's slow rhythm drowned quiet screams under the desert wind. Neighbors heard nothing. The park saw nothing. And Ray, meticulous as ever, recorded everything, confident no one would ever listen. When investigators first unsealed the steel doors of David Parker Ray's trailer, they expected to find a typical crime scene, disorder, frantic evidence of violence. Instead, they stepped into something disturbingly organized. The interior gleamed under fluorescent light, cold and metallic, like a surgical room, purpose-built for cruelty. Every surface had been planned. There was no sign of panic or haste. It was above all deliberate. At the center stood a padded table, bolted firmly to the floor. Leather restraints were fastened at wrists, ankles, chest, and neck, each positioned with exact spacing. Overhead hung a motorized hoist attached to adjustable chains. Against one wall rested an array of surgical tools, clamps, scalpels, modified extensions, syringes, and medical forceps. Each tool was labeled and aligned by size. Beside them, drawers contained electrical cords, bottles of lubricant, and cleaning supplies. To anyone else, it might have looked like a clinic, but this was a place designed to erase the boundary between life and suffering. Photographs later released through the investigation showed how thoroughly Ray had turned the trailer into an instrument of control. Hooks on the ceiling, pulleys mounted near mirrors, monitors wired to cameras pointing at the table's center. 2 television screens allowed him to watch captives from different angles, one broadcast into the next room. He could observe every twitch, every attempt at resistance, and replay them for review. He wanted to see his procedures as data, not emotion. The floor space was divided into zones. One corner contained a small cage with steel bars just wide enough for a person to kneel inside. Another held a cabinet stocked with anesthetics, tranquilizers, and a box of disposable syringes labeled "Use Once." Tests later confirmed traces of barbiturates and benzodiazepines, drugs known to cause memory gaps and paralysis. Experts suggested that part of his method was chemical control, ensuring victims woke, disoriented, unable to recall events clearly, and therefore unreliable to investigators if they escaped. Then there were the tapes. Dozens of cassettes, some unlabeled, some marked by date. The first recovered recording began with a static hum, followed by a man's monotone voice. It was Ray. He called it an orientation, a scripted address he played for each captive at the start. In it, he explained that resistance was useless and that obedience would determine survival. He referred to himself by aliases, Master, sometimes simply the man in charge. His tone was neither aggressive nor emotional. It was instructional, like an employee safety video. Forensic psychiatrists, who later analyzed the recordings, found them to be chilling examples of detached cruelty. Ray established compliance through psychological disintegration long before physical abuse began. Every word stripped the victim of identity. Survivors recounted the terror of realizing he had done this many times before, that everything they endured was rehearsed and perfected. Cynthia Vigil's testimony later confirmed that the tapes played continuously during her captivity. She lay chained to the table, forced to hear him describe her future. He told her what she would call him, what she must say if she wanted to eat or breathe without pain. The recording's lack of emotion was the worst part. It treated her existence as a problem to be managed. Investigators also found detailed diagrams tacked to a corkboard. They were hand-drawn, annotated with mechanical notes. Some showed restraint positions labeled with times and pressure points. Others mapped ways to suspend or rotate a human body using pulleys and counterweights. It suggested that Ray spent years perfecting his control systems like a machinist refining prototypes. The diagrams did not emphasize violence for its own sake. They focused on functionality. Pain was secondary to domination. The trailer's soundproofing explained how it remained invisible. Layers of insulation lined the walls, sealed behind aluminum panels. Even inside, with doors closed, the outside world vanished. Technicians demonstrated that shouting at full volume could barely be detected a few feet away. A generator in the adjacent shed powered the lights and hoist without connecting to the house, preventing electrical anomalies from alerting utilities. This level of isolation required planning and money, resources that spoke to the longevity of Ray's secret world. Two investigators described the moment they found a mirror suspended directly above the restraint table, tilted toward the captive's face. It ensured that each person inside would see themselves from above while immobilized. One detective said quietly, he wanted them to watch it happen. Another room held shelves filled with videotapes lacking labels. Most were blank or damaged, but fragments revealed glimpses of movements too dark to identify. To this day, many remain unverified pieces of evidence, classified due to their graphic content. Forensic cleaners catalogued everything: chains tethered to the floor, collars with adjustable screws to restrict breathing, rolls of duct tape, clamps attached to winches, even a machine Ray built that investigators could barely describe publicly. Every component reflected engineering expertise: welding seams polished smooth, bolts reinforced to prevent wear. Some items were repurposed from automotive tools. He converted efficiency into cruelty, turning craftsmanship into a mask for savagery. Search teams also uncovered catalogues from medical supply companies, annotated with orders placed under false names. Receipts stretched back years, evidence of premeditation so methodical it bordered on bureaucratic. Alongside them lay diaries spanning decades, entries detailing his projects, coded with letters and dates. Many corresponded to no known victims. Each line represented a possibility. Another life consumed and forgotten in this metallic room. The psychological environment of the toy box was as integral as its hardware. Ray created an atmosphere of total dependency. Light cycles controlled by him, feeding schedules, unpredictable punishment. Survivors recalled how fear became ritualized. They anticipated pain without knowing when it would come. Experts later termed this conditioned helplessness, a phenomenon where victims cease resisting because their reality has no pattern or escape. Ray appeared to understand it intuitively. He controlled not just bodies but time itself within those walls. When crime scene photographers documented the trailer, one image captured a small handwritten sign on the wall above the table. It read, "If they ain't broke, don't fix them." Investigators interpreted it as grim humor, a reflection of ownership over human life. Others saw it as evidence of his self-perception, the mechanic caring for his machines, indifferent to their humanity. Despite exhaustive analysis, no definitive number of victims could be confirmed from the artifacts alone. Some photographs showed faces later identified as missing women from nearby towns. Others remained unknown. There were also personal objects, jewelry, clothing, identification cards, stacked in boxes that seemed like trophies, yet filed as furniture maintenance parts. Everything blurred into organization. For months after the discovery, officers suffered nightmares. The precision of the space disturbed them more than the gore, because it implied years of undetected operation. One veteran investigator said quietly, "Monsters usually leave messes. He left blueprints." That clinical detachment, more than the violence itself, became the defining feature of his psychological profile. When the evidence finally left the desert that first week, trucks carried hundreds of labeled bags to state facilities. The The toy box stood empty, stripped bare, its secrets transferred to folders and storage rooms. But even in photographs, the scale of intentional suffering was overwhelming. This was not spontaneous evil. It was engineered, perfected, mechanized. To the residents of Truth or Consequences, the idea that one of their own built such a chamber was inconceivable. They drove past his property for years without suspecting anything unusual. Now the desert town faced the reality that the toy box had operated among them, soundless and invisible. The horrific precision of that trailer did not just expose one man's crimes, it revealed how easily cruelty can hide behind normalcy when wrapped in order and silence. In the months following the discovery of David Parker Ray's trailer, investigators tried to answer one question that kept surfacing. How many women had disappeared into that space before Cynthia Vigil broke free? The search began with known missing person reports from the early 1990s, but soon sprawled backward in time. The more they looked, the more unsolved cases seemed to echo the same pattern. Vanishing women, mostly young, often living on the margins. Records from Albuquerque, Truth or Consequences, and Socorro showed dozens of disappearances fitting a consistent profile. Many victims were sex workers, transient hitchhikers, or women with histories of drug use. In law enforcement databases of that era, those names rarely stayed active long. Officers assumed they moved on, left town, or chose to disappear. That assumption formed the perfect camouflage for a man like Ray. He did not need to bury the truth. Society ignored it for him. Detectives started compiling data. They mapped names, dates, and locations. Patterns emerged. Women last seen accepting rides near highways. Others who vanished after meeting a man driving a pickup, matching Ray's descriptions. Some left small clues. Abandoned belongings, missing calls to family, or eyewitness accounts mentioning an older man with grey hair and a calm voice. Each fragment pointed toward the Elephant Butte area. One of the earliest possible cases dated back to 1986. A waitress named Marie Parker from Truth or Consequences went missing after leaving a party with two acquaintances, one reportedly a quiet mechanic. Her car was found near the lake. At the time, authorities suspected drugs or voluntary disappearance. After Ray's arrest, Cindy Hendy confessed that Marie had been one of his victims. Evidence from the trailer included a videotape fragment showing a bound woman matching her description. Though partial and degraded, the footage confirmed she never left the desert alive. Another suspected victim was a woman named Kelly Garrett. In 1996, on the night after an argument with her husband, she joined friends at a bar and disappeared. Her last contact was a phone call saying she had met a couple heading to Elephant Butte. Later, after Ray's capture, Hendy identified Garrett by name, recounting details of her abduction and release. She claimed Ray drugged Garrett and, believing she would not remember, dropped her near her home days later. Garrett had awakened confused, her memory fractured, and assumed she had been attacked by strangers. It was not until she saw news coverage years later that she recognized her captor's face. Her testimony became one of the few first-hand windows into Ray's operations prior to Cynthia Vigil's survival. Cases like these illustrated how Ray's system conspired with social invisibility. Law enforcement rarely exchanged information across county lines, and the women most vulnerable to him were those least likely to be missed. Truck stops, bar districts, cheap motels, places of temporary faces. He studied them, selecting victims whose disappearances would generate silence instead of search parties. Investigators estimated potential victims numbering between 40 and 60 based on diaries recovered from his property. Each entry corresponded to coded initials, locations, or dates. Some diary notes described detailed sessions, while others simply listed a date and an object, 3/14 tape. It was unclear whether each represented a real event or fantasy, but the consistency across years suggested lived documentation. Specialists in forensic linguistics examined writing patterns and concluded that at least portions aligned with known disappearances. Still, without physical remains, most could never be confirmed. To humanize the statistics, detectives revisited families who had lost daughters, sisters, or mothers in the region. Many were shocked to learn that small details in their loved ones' cases matched Ray's methods, belts, cuffs, certain drugs found in toxicology. Some had spent years believing their relatives died from overdose or fled abusive relationships. Confronting the suggestion of deliberate abuse reopened decades-old wounds. One mother from Socorro described receiving phone calls from her daughter's supposed friends after she vanished, claiming she was fine and traveling. Experts later speculated Ray or Hendy might have made such calls to delay suspicion. Small manipulations like that, extended his freedom, letting authorities mark missing adults as voluntary. Detectives also uncovered references linking Ray to truck stops along Interstate 25, a corridor connecting major southwestern cities. That route provided both victims and disposal options, vast stretches of desert where law enforcement coverage was minimal. Cadaver dogs searched multiple sites around Elephant Butte, including old gravel pits and abandoned properties once leased under Ray's name. Soil scans revealed promising anomalies, but no human remains were recovered, conclusively tied to him. The desert preserved silence as efficiently as Ray did. The absence of bodies frustrated investigators and families alike. Without physical evidence, prosecutors relied heavily on testimony and the forensic materials found in the trailer. Yet every missing name added weight to the probability that Cynthia Vigil's escape had interrupted a long-running pattern rather than isolated crimes. Among the testimonies collected after Ray's arrest were several stories from women who had survived unreported abductions. Some came forward only after seeing his photograph on television. One described being drugged at a bar, waking up restrained in a metallic room, and later abandoned miles from town. Another recalled hearing a woman's recorded voice comforting her, possibly Cindy Hendy, before blacking out again. Their fragmented memories aligned with the trailer's layout and the use of certain sedatives. For each surviving account, there were others only implied by evidence: unclaimed jewelry, torn clothing, photographs of unidentified women smiling awkwardly into a camera. Many appeared taken before restraint, suggesting moments of confusion rather than terror, lured into trust seconds before imprisonment. Investigators hoped that releasing still images publicly might spark recognition, but few led to confirmed identities. The community's transient nature meant many of those women had already been written out of state databases before Ray was ever suspected. The lack of closure extended beyond forensics. Psychologists assisting the case warned that the uncertainty itself inflicted secondary trauma on families. Without remains, grief had no endpoint. Authorities kept files open, listing them as potentially linked to DPR, shorthand for David Parker Ray. Over time, those initials became a grim symbol in case archives across New Mexico, a placeholder where resolution should have been. Even years after Ray's death, new information occasionally surfaced. Search operations resumed periodically, guided by Hendy's shifting recollections or new mapping technology. Most ended in frustration. The region's size, hundreds of square miles of rock and brush, made full searches impossible. What lingered instead were human stories half told, glimpsed only through Ray's records and survivors' fragments of memory. The cumulative impact of those disappearances turned the case from isolated atrocity to systemic indictment. It revealed how marginalized women could vanish repeatedly without systems noticing. For investigators, the missing women were more than statistics. They were the measure of how long indifference had enabled one man's precision. While forensic teams continued analyzing evidence, profiles of suspected victims filled office walls, photographs overlapping like a human collage. Each represented stolen years, unanswered calls, empty birthdays. The team understood that most would never see closure. The desert had swallowed too much. But documenting them was a way to reclaim their existence from the void David Parker Ray created behind his unremarkable trailer. In the early hours of March 22nd, 1999, 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil stood handcuffed in a dim motel room in Albuquerque, waiting for what she thought was another routine client. She had worked to survive, and the man who had approached her seemed like any other. He was older, soft-spoken, polite enough to lower her guard. When she turned to remove her shoes, he pressed a badge to her face and said he was police. Then came a flash of metal, handcuffs, a cord around her neck, and chloroform's sickly sweetness. Within seconds, darkness closed in. When she woke, everything had changed. Her wrists ached, her ankles burned, and she was lying inside a small metallic space illuminated by artificial light. A man's voice played from hidden speakers, calm and rehearsed. "Hello there," it began, followed by precise instructions. The tone was not angry. It was bureaucratic. He told her she would remain captive, that cooperation determined comfort, and that resistance meant pain. She realized the voice was not live. It was recorded. The man who entered afterward introduced himself as David. He spoke without expression, explaining rules and consequences while a woman stood nearby watching silently. That woman, Cindy Hendy, assisted as he fixed restraints around Cynthia's neck and ankles. Drugs still clouded her mind, blurring perception, but she sensed discipline in his movements, not frenzy. He worked like a technician performing maintenance, not a man consumed by passion. Over the next 3 days, Cynthia learned her captor's patterns. Ray alternated between direct assault and psychological torment. When she cried, he recorded it. When she begged, he took notes. Hendy at times mocked her, other times acted almost sympathetic, feeding her or cleaning wounds. It was Hendy, not Ray, who occasionally slipped and revealed that Cynthia was not the first. "He's done this before," she whispered once. "Just do not make him mad." The words turned fear into certainty. If she did not escape quickly, she would not leave alive. The trailer's design made fleeing seem impossible. Metal walls sealed every sound. Chains anchored her to an overhead rail that adjusted by switch. Food came irregularly. She memorized small details, the position of hooks, the pattern of Ray's footsteps, the timing of Hendy's visits. Each moment became data in her silent plan. Her chance came late, on the third day. That afternoon, Hendy argued with Ray inside the main house. Through the open door, Cynthia heard raised voices and the clatter of glass breaking. When Hendy returned alone to care for a minor injury, she seemed distracted, leaving the keys on a nearby table before answering a phone. Seconds stretched. Cynthia's heart raced. She forced herself to stay silent, then reached forward, wrists trembling, dragging the chain across the table until the keys fell to the floor. The sound made Hendy turn. In panic, Cynthia swung the heavy lamp toward her, striking her head. Hendy collapsed briefly, cursing. Blood pooled across the floor. In that blur of adrenaline, Cynthia unlocked her wrists, yanked at the collar, and stumbled toward the trailer's exit. Behind her, Hendy screamed for Ray. Cynthia sprinted barefoot into the blinding desert daylight, wearing only a metal dog collar and chain. Outside, the air cut like sandpaper. Each step tore the skin from her feet, but she did not stop. She ran through open brush, following the sound of cars on the highway miles away. The chain clanged against her leg, slowing her down. She spotted distant rooftops and pushed toward them. Behind her, dogs barked. Somewhere on the property, a man shouted her name. Ray's voice, deep and eerily calm, even in pursuit. After nearly a mile, she reached the edge of a trailer park near Elephant Butte. A woman washing her car looked up to see Cynthia collapse beside her, covered in dirt and blood. Startled, the woman dashed inside for her husband. They brought a blanket, locked the door, and called 911. The husband later recalled that she repeated one phrase over and over, "He is going to kill me." Within minutes, police from Truth or Consequences responded. They found Cynthia trembling, her wrists swollen and streaked with rust. She could barely describe what happened, but insisted another woman was involved. Officers removed the chain with bolt cutters and examined deep bruises along her body. Her description of the trailer, interior metal, medical instruments, and a recorded voice, seemed implausible until they realized the address she gave matched that of a local park employee, David Parker Ray. Officers approached Ray's property cautiously, believing they might be confronting a standard abduction. What they found instead exceeded any expectation. A search yielded immediate confirmation of Vigil's story: chains, restraints, blood traces, and medical instruments. The toy box, as Ray had called it, stood only yards behind his house. Meanwhile, medics transported Cynthia to safety. At the hospital, detectives noted her composure amid trauma. She provided a clear timeline, describing Hendy's oversight and Ray's mechanical indifference. When she mentioned the recorded speech, investigators realized they were dealing with a repeat offender who operated like a regimented system. Cindy Hendy attempted to flee that same night, but was captured in the nearby town of Elephant Butte. During interrogation, she initially denied everything, but quickly broke under pressure. Her injuries from the escaped victim betrayed her lie. She admitted that Ray had held multiple women captive and that he always prepared a tape first. Asked why she assisted, she said quietly, "It was easier to let him do it than to fight him." Her confession guided officers to the full trailer, revealing what would become one of the most disturbing scenes in modern criminal history. For the first responders who had met Cynthia hours earlier, the discovery confirmed the unimaginable. The young woman had survived a place designed so no one ever would. Cynthia's courage transformed the investigation from hidden atrocity to public reckoning. She agreed to describe her experience in detail despite fear of retaliation. Her testimony forced authorities to treat previously dismissed disappearances as potential homicides. FBI agents flew in to coordinate statewide searches, and forensic teams sealed off the property with bright tape and floodlights that glowed through the night. While investigators combed the scene, Cynthia remained under protective supervision. Reporters soon swarmed the hospital, but police shielded her identity until formal charges were filed. When the story broke, national headlines framed her escape as a miracle. one woman's willpower defeating years of secrecy. For the community, it was also a wake-up call. People who had once greeted Ray at grocery stores now realized the quiet man next door had been harboring industrial cruelty. Detectives later said that without Vigil's precision in recounting what she saw, they might never have located the trailer's hidden compartment or recognized the significance of the recorded tapes. Her memory became the blueprint for the search warrant that dismantled Ray's illusion of normalcy. Every victim profile, every diary entry, every piece of evidence that followed stemmed from those moments she chose to run. In psychological evaluations afterward, specialists noted that survivors who escape from prolonged captivity often display remarkable focus. Cynthia fit that pattern. Her instinct to memorize surroundings, recall sound sequences, and exploit distractions aligned perfectly with survival behavior under extreme coercion. She had, unknowingly, performed the kind of situational assessment police are trained for. Years later, in interviews, she said she still heard his recorded voice in dreams. But what mattered most was that she stopped him. Her escape did not just end her own nightmare, it exposed a serial predator who might otherwise have continued indefinitely. In that sense, the moment she grabbed those keys was not only the turning point for one captive, it marked the beginning of truth, overtaking secrecy in the deserts of New Mexico. When police arrived at David Parker Ray's property on that March afternoon in 1999, they expected to find a standard kidnapping scene. What they encountered was a compound designed for concealment. The main house sat modestly among scattered trailers and desert plants. It looked like any other maintenance worker's residence, quiet, sun-bleached, unassuming. But as officers secured the perimeter, what began as a search quickly transformed into an organized operation that drew agencies from across New Mexico. Officers from the Elephant Butte Division entered first, accompanied by the Sierra County Sheriff's deputies. Inside the small living room, they found details that immediately supported Cynthia Vigil's claims. Cuffs mounted to the wall, nylon ropes coiled neatly, and syringes positioned on a counter. The air smelled of cleaning chemicals, a scent so strong it burned their eyes. Signs of a struggle were evident in the hallway. A tipped lamp, a trail of blood drops leading to the rear exit. Then came the locked trailer out back, secured with heavy chains and an external padlock unlike anything the officers had seen before. It took nearly 20 minutes to cut the lock. The door opened to the chamber, later known around the world as the toy box. Crime scene specialists, prepared for the worst, were nonetheless stunned into silence. Floodlights illuminated metallic walls, medical tools, restraints, and mechanical equipment whose functions defied immediate understanding. Everything inside seemed deliberate, prearranged, as though its owner expected it to be examined. One detective later described it as a museum of cruelty presented by an engineer. Photographers documented every inch, aware that a single misstep could destroy evidence crucial to identifying victims. They shot hundreds of frames: the restraint table, the shelves, the videotapes labeled by date. Technicians collected fingerprints, hair samples, and traces of blood found near the hoist mechanism. Beneath one cabinet lay a handwritten notebook, its pages filled with coded notations, initials, dates, and cryptic measurements. It read like a catalogue. Some entries corresponded with missing person cases, stretching back more than a decade. Outside, David Parker Ray stood handcuffed beside his daughter Jessie, who had arrived midway through the search. He looked composed, not angry or frightened. When sheriff's deputies read him his rights, he asked calmly, "For what, exactly?" His voice carried none of the anxiety investigators expected. That composure unnerved them even more than the devices inside. He offered short, precise sentences, volunteering nothing but denying little. One officer later recalled, "It was like speaking to a man discussing someone else's property, not his own crimes." Cindy Hendy, already detained from a nearby location, was brought in shortly afterward. Her demeanor contrasted sharply with Ray's. She trembled, eyes swollen, and immediately began talking, first in denial, then shifting to partial confession. She admitted that the trailer had been used for years, and that Ray recorded many of his sessions. She described being both accomplice and captive, claiming fear, then complicity. Her words confirmed details they had not yet released publicly, lending credibility to her account. Detectives split teams between examining the property and interviewing witnesses. Neighboring residents, shocked by the sudden influx of police, answered questions through tears and disbelief. Most said Ray was polite, quiet, always fixing something in his yard. None had heard screams or suspicious noises. The soundproofing, investigators realized, had been absolute. Even trained dogs outside the trailer reacted strangely, whining and refusing to approach the main door. Inside the chamber, forensic analysts found objects meticulously stored in labeled drawers, restraints polished to prevent noise, clamps of various sizes, anesthetic vials arranged alphabetically. Chemical analysis later proved that several compounds matched what was found in Cynthia Vigil's blood, barbiturates and benzodiazepines strong enough to induce amnesia. The evidence suggested systematic drugging meant to erase memory, ensuring victims, if released, would be dismissed as unreliable witnesses. Among the most disturbing finds was an audio tape lying beside an outdated recorder. As it played, officers heard Ray's voice deliver the same introduction Cynthia described, word for word. For investigators, the recording ended speculation. It was proof of premeditation, of repeated ritual. They listened only briefly before stopping the playback, the content too graphic to continue. Each repetition of that voice reinforced how mechanical his approach had been. The search widened beyond the trailer. Detectives combed adjacent sheds, vehicles, and the lakefront area where Ray worked. In each location, evidence of his secondary life emerged. Cameras, restraints, and diaries documenting maintenance routines, intertwined with coded sessions. It became clear that his actions were not impulsive. They were scheduled, integrated into daily life. Colleagues at the state park later recalled noticing nothing unusual. He clocked in on time, performed maintenance checks, and chatted casually about weather and engines. That ordinary image fragmented completely under the weight of new evidence. State police requested backup from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Profilers joined the operation to interpret the scene through psychological frameworks. Early assessments described Ray as an organized, non-lethal sadist, meaning his goal was not murder but control, achieved through calculated endurance tests. The notion disturbed investigators who had assumed serial offenders always sought death. In Ray's case, survival of victims functioned as continued dominance, proof of his absolute authority. As teams moved evidence to secure storage, the emotional toll became apparent. Veteran officers stepped outside in silence, cigarette smoke mixing with desert wind. Many later sought counseling. The images they documented could not be forgotten. Even crime scene veterans called it unlike anything they had witnessed, a synthesis of intelligence, patience, and cruelty. Cindy Hendy's cooperation accelerated the investigation. Under continued questioning, she guided officers to buried items around the property. Rings, keys, watches. She said they belonged to women Ray finished with. When asked where the bodies were, she shrugged, unsure. According to her, Ray sometimes released victims, sometimes did not. He liked to watch them try to forget, she said quietly. Her statements, though unreliable in parts, pushed authorities to begin large-scale excavation around Elephant Butte. Cadaver dogs scoured dry gullies and abandoned lots. No confirmed remains were immediately recovered, deepening the sense that much more lay hidden. Meanwhile, Ray maintained his silence. During formal booking, he requested clarification of charges, again appearing calm. Detectives noted his indifference to Hendy's arrest or Cynthia's survival. His answers were clipped and polite. When asked about the trailer, he remarked only, "That is my work area. You will find tools." That phrase echoed chillingly among investigators. It revealed no denial, only classification. Everything, even abuse, was redefined as work. As night fell, floodlights illuminated his fenced property. Evidence techs continued labeling items, medical instruments, electrical distributions, written notes. The list filled dozens of boxes. Items that initially seemed innocuous carried forensic significance: fibers, fingerprints, DNA traces likely belonging to multiple victims. The process lasted days. Each discovery raised new questions about scale. Local media soon surrounded the site, broadcasting live segments from outside police tape. The town of Truth or Consequences, long known for its quiet charm, became synonymous with one of the nation's grisliest criminal scenes. Residents struggled to reconcile the friendly park mechanic with the contents of that trailer. At local diners, conversations dropped to whispers when officers entered. Parents began locking doors earlier, haunted by the knowledge that cruelty had lived unnoticed among them for years. Within 48 hours, formal charges were filed: kidnapping, abuse, and conspiracy. Federal agencies joined to assess possible interstate offenses. Investigators from Arizona and Texas sent representatives, cross-referencing long-missing cases with written diaries. Leads multiplied faster than they could be verified. Forensics laboratories overflowed with evidence shipments, forcing temporary storage expansions. Through it all, Ray remained expressionless. Interrogators attempted psychological pressure, playing audio from his own tapes, confronting him with photographs of recovered tools. He showed mild irritation, no guilt. A forensic psychiatrist later commented that Ray exhibited affective flattening, a rare absence of emotional response, often seen in psychopathy. His measured demeanor, even under accusation, underscored his need for control. He believed the narrative belonged to him alone. By the end of that week, authorities closed off the property entirely, sealing the trailer as prime evidence. Inside, they left markers denoting each object's placement for future reconstruction. Investigators would later recreate the entire interior for court presentation, allowing juries to step, virtually, into the space where so many disappeared. The arrest of David Parker Ray represented both triumph and unease. Justice had begun, but understanding had barely started. The more forensic analysts uncovered, the clearer it became that the toy box was not just a crime scene, it was a blueprint of obsession, the physical map of one man's effort to engineer submission. For the detectives who had pried open that chained door, the memory of what waited inside would outlast headlines and trials. When psychiatrists and profilers began studying David Parker Ray after his arrest, they knew they were confronting an offender whose actions challenged the usual framework of serial violence. He was not motivated by chaos or rage. He was organized, measured, and disturbingly consistent. Where most offenders reacted out of impulse or emotion, Ray operated like a scientist conducting controlled experiments, each victim treated as another step toward perfecting domination. Experts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit described Ray as an organized sadist, a classification reserved for offenders who derive satisfaction primarily through control rather than destruction. What made him different was scale and precision. From the construction of his trailer to the language in his diaries, everything pointed to one psychological constant: mastery. He sought total authority, not just over physical movement, but over perception itself. In his world, even a victim's memories were subject to design. Clinical assessments revealed several overlapping personality traits: narcissism, antisocial behavior, and paraphilic sadism. The narcissism explained his arrogance in assuming he could outsmart investigators. The antisocial elements showed in his disregard for empathy, remorse, or social boundaries. But his defining feature was sadism expressed through meticulous structure. He did not abuse to release tension, he orchestrated it like an art form governed by rules he wrote himself. Forensic psychologists compared his behavior to that of other organized offenders, the calculated routines of Ted Bundy, the ritualism of BTK. Yet Ray lacked their overt charm or need for recognition. He stayed hidden, preferring the perfection of procedure to the thrill of bragging. He once told an acquaintance, "People destroy their fun by talking about it." That secrecy was not shame, it was control. Speaking aloud would hand power to others. His silence ensured ownership of his narrative until the end. Investigators noticed that Ray's trailer resembled less a dungeon and more a workshop of theories made tangible. Each modification demonstrated adaptive learning. When a method failed to produce the desired behavior, he redesigned. Psychologist Dr. Kristen Hayden, who reviewed his files, remarked that he turned psychology into engineering. He wanted predictable results, not surprises. Notes within his journals supported that view. He categorized victims by resistance levels, physical endurance, and verbal reactions. He was not documenting pain but compliance thresholds. During interrogation, Ray remained composed, answering direct questions with clinical detachment. When asked why he recorded the orientation tapes in advance, he replied, "Efficiency saves repetition." No emotional inflection, no attempt to justify. That sentence alone summarized his psyche. Efficiency as virtue, people as processes. In his mind, crime became maintenance, each interaction part of a system requiring calibration. One recurring element in his writings involved performance. He saw himself as both craftsman and teacher, coaching his accomplices through sessions. Cindy Hendy later recalled him explaining psychological principles behind obedience. He referenced conditioning techniques, alternating between intimidation and reward to shape behavior. Experts recognized elements of military training and behaviorist psychology, systems he likely absorbed during his army service. He manipulated fear through predictability, understanding that consistent reactions breed submission faster than random violence. What struck analysts most was his emotional flatness. He spoke of captivity the way a mechanic discusses gear ratios. Even when confronted with testimony describing unimaginable suffering, he offered mild corrections about logistical details. That gap between cognitive understanding and emotional absence defined him. Dr. Janice Moore, a forensic psychiatrist involved in the case, described him as a man who replaced empathy with curiosity. He did not hate his victims, he studied them. In the hierarchy of his world, understanding suffering took precedence over feeling it. Inside Ray's head, control equaled order, disorder represented weakness. His life outside crime mirrored that principle: neatly arranged tools, consistent schedules, minimal social contact. Investigators discovered that his diaries aligned precisely with his work shifts. He planned abductions around maintenance logs, ensuring plausible alibis. This integration of abuse into routine reflected what psychologists term compartmentalization, the ability to isolate incompatible behaviors without cognitive dissonance. Ray could service a park generator in the morning, abuse a captive by evening, and sleep soundly, all compartments sealed from one another. Yet, his precision did not erase insecurity. Colleagues and ex-partners described him as sensitive to criticism, withdrawn when questioned, and prone to sudden silence if contradicted. That fragile ego often drives sadistic control fantasies. The abuser restores self-worth by reducing others to helplessness. Ray's upbringing, dominated by an authoritarian father who equated obedience with respect, likely cemented this pattern. For him, dominance was not only physical, it was self-definition. His fascination with recording devices also revealed psychological depth. By taping victims and replaying scenes, he re-experienced control without risk. Playback allowed the illusion of permanence, each act immortalized, each captive still under his command even after release or death. Experts compared this to compulsive archivism found in other narcissistic offenders. They collect proof, not for nostalgia but validation. The existence of the recording confirms superiority. I made it happen, and it exists because of me. When analyzing Ray's conversations with Hendy, psychologists observed how he framed their crimes as shared discovery rather than coercion. He often used plural pronouns, we, ours, to diffuse moral burden and sustain unity. Hendy later admitted she adopted his language unconsciously, calling victims projects. This linguistic control exemplified coercive persuasion, the subtle rewriting of meaning, until accomplices perceive abuse as partnership. Ray did not just enslave physically, he colonized language itself. Comparisons to other predatory personalities highlight an essential difference. Ray's actions reveal minimal impulsivity. Many offenders escalate as tension builds, culminating in uncontrolled violence. Ray's satisfaction came from perpetuity, the continuation of order. Killing ended control. Therefore, he avoided it when possible. Survivors noted that he threatened execution constantly but rarely followed through unless discipline failed. Psychologists interpreted this restraint as ultimate expression of dominance, sparing life not from mercy, but to prolong ownership. In interviews, Ray dismissed moral frameworks entirely. When asked if he considered his actions wrong, he deflected, "Everyone has hobbies. Mine just are not accepted." To him, societal rules were arbitrary agreements among weaker minds. This total moral disengagement placed him within a narrow band of psychopathy distinguished by intellectualization. He rationalized atrocity as experimentation, insulating himself from guilt through semantics. At trial, observers saw glimpses of that same self-assurance. He sat upright, hands folded, occasionally taking notes. When witnesses recounted moments of horror, he sometimes nodded slightly, as though assessing accuracy. Psychiatrists later reviewed footage of those sessions, describing micro-expressions consistent with satisfaction rather than remorse. For Ray, the courtroom was simply another controlled environment, one he no longer commanded, yet still evaluated for procedural efficiency. Behind that composure, however, was fragility masked by discipline. Pathological control often originates in terror of vulnerability. Ray's early experiences with humiliation, isolation, and paternal dominance bred a lifelong fear of powerlessness. By scripting every detail of captivity, from recorded introductions to release protocols, he erased unpredictability, the force that once governed his childhood. In mastering others, he believed he had mastered fate. Experts agreed that Ray represented a rare psychological hybrid, sadistic curiosity merged with mechanical intellect. Most offenders either intellectualize their impulses or succumb to them emotionally. Ray synthesized both. His intellect provided structure, his paraphilia provided purpose. The result was cruelty disguised as craftsmanship. One profiler summarized it. He did not see victims as people or even toys. He saw them as mechanisms proving his control worked. When asked during evaluation about religion or morality, Ray shrugged. He claimed belief in natural order, a phrase recurring in his writings. To him, life divided between those who control and those controlled. He saw himself in the first category by design, not luck. That worldview eliminated empathy entirely. Suffering was not evil, merely function. In the sterile logic of his mind, the toy box was not hell, but laboratory. Even his eventual arrest fit the narrative he had built internally. Psychologists studying transcripts noted how often he used passive voice. Mistakes were made. Not I made mistakes. Deflection reinforced his sense of being observer rather than actor. He diagnosed himself during one exchange, saying, "I over-engineered it. Too organized draws attention." That self-critique signaled pride more than regret. Months after his death in custody, clinicians continued analyzing his case for insights into the complexities of organized sadism. They concluded that Ray's intelligence shielded his pathology, allowing him to simulate normalcy through competence. He did not feign kindness but reliability, the quieter disguise that seldom raises alarms. This strategic neutrality may have been his most dangerous trait. Looking at photographs of his workspace, experts saw more than instruments. They saw personality externalized, clean lines, symmetry, precision. Every bolt tightened, every tool returned to place. The trailer functioned as architectural autobiography. It told the story of a man who replaced emotional chaos with measurable order, who sought godlike authority through mechanics. Ultimately, David Parker Ray's mind revealed not spontaneous evil but deliberate construction, a psyche that built horror, one adjustment at a time. When the trial of David Parker Ray began, years of silent horror finally entered a public room. The courthouse in Truth or Consequences was small, its wooden benches built for traffic cases, not a proceeding that would draw national media. Yet from the first day, every seat was filled. Reporters, relatives of missing women, and residents who once called Ray a neighbor sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear what really happened inside the trailer known as the toy box. The legal process was complicated from the start. Despite hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, few living victims could testify. Many probable victims were gone, and those who survived often battled memory loss caused by the drugs Ray used. Prosecutors faced a system meant to reward clear testimony and concrete proof. What they had instead were fragments, records, coded diaries, and a handful of traumatized voices. Still, they built their strategy around Cynthia Vigil's escape, and the corroboration provided by Ray's partner, Cindy Hendy. Cynthia Vigil was the prosecution's anchor. On the stand, she spoke calmly, describing how she had been abducted, chained, and forced to hear Ray's recorded instructions. The jury listened to portions of that cassette. The air in the courtroom turned silent, except for the monotonous voice from the speakers. Some jurors cried. Others stared at the table, unable to meet the sound with their eyes. Cynthia explained how she memorized details of the trailer, the lights, the tools, Hendy's momentary mistakes. Her recollection formed a map investigators had already confirmed. It was, as one prosecutor said, truth built from endurance. Then came Cindy Hendy's testimony. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, she spoke as a cooperating witness, hoping for leniency. Her voice shook at first, but gained steadiness as she recounted years of involvement. She told jurors that Ray had shown her the trailer early in their relationship and called it a place for exploration. Gradually she became participant, not by belief in his philosophy, but through slow corrosion of resistance. Under questioning, she admitted bringing victims to the property and helping subdue them. When asked why she stayed, Hendy said, "He made me feel like it was normal, like I was helping him study something." Her testimony was graphic, matching the evidence recovered from the scene. She identified items in photographs, explaining how Ray organized sessions like experiments with specific goals. Hendy's fear was palpable, but defense attorneys seized on her criminal record, arguing she had shaped her story to curry favor. They emphasized her drug history and prior convictions, casting her as unreliable. The defense strategy hinged on reframing everything found in the trailer as consensual equipment used privately between adults. They claimed the women were voluntary participants too ashamed to admit it afterward. For weeks, that argument battled against overwhelming unease. The prosecution countered with forensic data, traces of blood belonging to multiple individuals, chemical residues matching sedatives, and the recorded speech void of consent or mutual participation. They played brief segments of the orientation tape again, pointing out Ray's tone, detached authority, incompatible with any plausible role-play. Expert witnesses in psychology testified that his meticulous language and the presence of drugs proved coercion, not fantasy. Ray himself sat silently through most of it, wearing glasses, jaw tightened. Observers remarked that he rarely looked toward the witness stand. During cross-examinations, he scribbled notes and occasionally whispered to his attorney. His expression never changed. even when graphic details surfaced. One journalist later wrote, "If guilt had a face, it looked disappointingly calm. That calm unnerved victims' families far more than any outburst could have. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors introduced evidence from earlier suspected crimes. Kelly Garrett, one of the few women to survive before Cynthia Vigil, testified by video. She described being drugged, waking bound in a metallic room, then losing memory for days. Her husband initially had not believed her. Seeing Ray's photograph years later had revived buried terror. Her fragmented story echoed the pattern so neatly that even the defense struggled to dismiss it as coincidence. Jessie Ray, David's daughter, appeared briefly under subpoena. Her statements were limited. She acknowledged seeing some of her father's behavior, but claimed ignorance of criminal acts. Observers sensed conflict, the loyalty of family colliding with the gravity of evidence. Her testimony added complexity, but little clarity. After months of proceedings, prosecutors struck plea agreements, rather than risking mistrial due to fading memories. Ray faced multiple charges across counties. To prevent constant retrials, both sides negotiated. Eventually, he accepted a deal, acknowledging kidnapping and abuse, avoiding the death penalty but ensuring life imprisonment. Victims' advocates criticized the bargain, arguing it denied full justice to the disappeared. Yet, practical limits left few alternatives. Without bodies or coherent recollections, convictions on murder charges remained uncertain. Throughout sentencing, Ray maintained composure. When offered a chance to speak, he declined, telling the judge, "I have nothing to add." Those 5 words echoed the emptiness at his core. The courtroom, expecting outrage or apology, met only silence. The judge called his acts crimes beyond reason, crimes beyond words, then imposed a sentence exceeding 220 years. In the back row, Cynthia Vigil wept quietly, supported by relatives. Hendy, already sentenced separately to decades in prison, did not attend. During appeals hearings that followed, Ray's attorneys attempted to challenge evidence chain and witness credibility. None succeeded. Each appeal reaffirmed that the trailer, tapes, and testimonies painted an irrefutable picture of sustained abuse. Psychological evaluations submitted to the court confirmed he met diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, defined by lack of empathy and manipulative intelligence. The clinical tone of the reports mirrored the tone of his own notes, precise, emotionless, focused on systems rather than suffering. The community surrounding Elephant Butte never recovered its sense of normalcy. Reporters lingered for years, and tourism dropped. Locals who once trusted their quiet neighbor felt a mix of guilt and disbelief. The courtroom, though just a small building, became the symbolic site where the facade of small-town safety shattered. When the final verdicts were read, survivors described an unusual relief, not of joy, but of confirmation. Their stories were real. The chamber had existed. The voice on the tape belonged to a man who would never leave prison. Yet justice carried an undertone of incompleteness. Many victims remained unidentified. Their families would never see closure. Ray's diaries hinted at numbers far beyond those proven. Even as he awaited transfer to state prison, he never revealed the full list. 3 years later, in 2002, before further sentencing in additional jurisdictions, Ray collapsed from a heart attack after a pre-trial conference. He died instantly. No confession followed, no final statement to explain what investigators had sought for years. Some saw his quiet death as evasion, others accepted it as anticlimax, fitting his nature, control to the end, even over the story's closure. After his death, prosecutors archived evidence too extensive for a single facility. The trailer was dismantled and stored in sections for research and law enforcement training. The courtroom transcripts entered academic study, referenced in seminars on forensic psychology and investigative failures. For Cynthia Vigil and other survivors, each document stood as testament that their voices had broken through years of disbelief. The case files labeled DPR remain active for review whenever new missing person data appears. In the legal sense, justice concluded with a life sentence that outlived the man. In the social sense, it marked accountability for institutions that once ignored those most at risk. The courtroom had not only judged a criminal, it had indicted complacency. From that final day forward, the name David Parker Ray ceased being rumor and became record, proof that order can disguise evil until someone dares to speak. When David Parker Ray died in 2002, the morning news carried the headline quietly, "Toy Box Killer Dead of Heart Attack." There were no dramatic last words, no confession left behind. He simply collapsed in a courthouse holding cell, while waiting for yet another round of pre-trial proceedings. For victims, detectives, and families still hoping he might reveal burial sites or names, the news landed like a door slamming shut. Decades of unanswered questions died with him. In Sierra County, investigators gathered in the evidence room surrounded by boxes labeled DPR. Some had spent years trying to coax details from him. Others had dug through the desert searching for remains. Now, their quarry was gone. Lead Detective Pat Apodaca said later, "We did not want revenge. We wanted answers." His death robbed everyone of that. The files remained open, but closure drifted further away. News of Ray's death reached survivors differently. Cynthia Vigil, living under a new identity, told reporters she felt both relief and anger. The man who had hunted women like specimens would never face the full consequence of what he had done. Yet she also admitted she no longer woke in fear of his release. Other families sent letters to the district attorney's office, some thanking the team, others demanding renewed searches at Elephant Butte Lake. For months after his death, law enforcement teams returned to those quiet shores. Cadaver dogs followed grids marked on satellite maps, each square representing coordinates Hendy once mentioned. Excavators turned layers of compacted soil, their movements mirrored by reporters lining the edges of the dig sites. Nothing surfaced. The desert gave nothing back. With every unproductive search, skepticism grew. Had Ray buried his victims at all, or had he disposed of them in ways even more efficient? Cindy Hendy, serving her sentence at a New Mexico correctional facility, granted interviews during that time. Her story shifted over the years. Sometimes she insisted Ray had killed multiple women. Other times she claimed most were released. She spoke of distant burial points she could not precisely recall. Investigators followed each new claim, only to find barren sand and sun-bleached stones. Still, her cooperation remained their only remaining compass. She seemed haunted less by guilt than by confusion, unsure whether she had been participant, witness, or survivor herself. Meanwhile, the town of Truth or Consequences struggled to shed the stigma attached to his name. Stores near the lake displayed newspaper clippings as memorials to resilience, yet tourism dipped sharply. The casual beauty of Elephant Butte's waters took on an uneasy significance. People could not help wondering what lay beneath. State officials eventually ordered Ray's property demolished. The trailer that had housed his crimes was dismantled piece by piece, transported to a law enforcement training compound for study. Its absence left an empty lot, surrounded by chain link. Locals drove past quickly, unwilling to slow down. Psychologists continued analyzing the case long after his death. They used it as curriculum in criminal profiling courses, focusing not on gore but on the mechanisms of concealment. Ray's ability to operate undetected for decades became a cautionary example of systemic blindness. His victims were primarily marginalized women, addicts, runaways. Each label worked as camouflage, allowing police reports to fade as paperwork rather than prompts for investigation. In seminars, experts argued that Ray's longevity was not just his doing, it was society's. For survivors, rebuilding meant decades of therapy and public scrutiny. Some received compensation through victim support funds, others preferred anonymity. In rare interviews, they spoke less about the events themselves and more about what it felt like to be believed after years of dismissal. Cynthia Vigil's later advocacy for missing persons highlighted that shift. She told a journalist, "They did not listen until I ran out screaming. How many others could not?" Her question became an indictment of apathy that echoed far beyond New Mexico. Investigators also revisited procedural lapses, the fragmented databases, the lack of coordination between counties, and the cultural bias that had devalued victims living on society's edge. The State Attorney General's post-mortem review concluded that had early disappearances been investigated comprehensively, Ray might have been stopped a decade earlier. But those hypotheticals arrived too late. The only certainty left was loss, measured in years erased from ordinary lives. Academics and documentarians later transformed the case into study material on deviance and institutional oversight. University lectures dissected his psychological architecture, while advocacy groups used it to press for reform in how missing person files were prioritized. Broadly, Ray's name became shorthand for how evil can function under regulation and routine. Instead of inspiring fear of monsters, his story revealed how bureaucracy itself can serve as camouflage. Even now, long after every trial concluded, sporadic searches resume whenever new technology offers promise. In 2011, ground-penetrating radar teams scanned previously inaccessible ravines near Elephant Butte. The results suggested soil disturbances but no clear human remains. Each new exploration reignites local anxiety, a reminder that the desert still holds unsolved stories. Law enforcement continues to log anonymous tips, most unverifiable, some heartbreakingly specific. One caller reported a night sighting of a pickup matching Ray's decades-old vehicle near a rest area long after his death, proving myths never rest easily. Within criminology circles, one debate endures. Was David Parker Ray primarily a killer or an obsessive collector of submission? The absence of confirmed murders complicates classification. Psychologists argue that defining him only by life or death obscures the broader horror, his deliberate transformation of people into mechanisms for power. Whether victims survived or not, the intent remained annihilation of identity, a violence deeper than murder. In the years following his death, the state marked minor victories. New legislation improved coordination for missing adult investigations. Databases linking transient populations now flag patterns earlier. Each reform bore traces of lessons learned from the Toy Box Killer case, yet no policy could compensate for the lives uncounted. In memorial exhibits curated by advocacy groups, victims' faces share space with notebook copies and photographs of desert search teams, a juxtaposition of humanity and evidence. For locals, time softened but never erased the wound. The name once whispered now serves as a warning that depravity rarely arrives as a stranger. It can live quietly beside you, fixing engines, waving from a driveway. The desert winds still move through Elephant Butte at dusk, carrying fragments of that story, proof that some horrors end in court, while others persist in memory. The aftermath of David Parker Ray is not merely a closed file. It is a continuing reminder of how silence and neglect allow the unimaginable to exist undisturbed. In the years since David Parker Ray's trailer was sealed and dismantled, his case has remained less a chapter of crime history than a mirror reflecting what happens when cruelty hides behind routine. It forced communities, investigators, and psychologists to ask not just how such brutality existed, but how it persisted unnoticed for decades. Beneath every forensic report lay a more unsettling truth. The machinery of his crimes wasn't confined to the trailer. It was embedded in the systems that ignored his victims. The survivors became voices of accountability. Cynthia Vigil transformed her ordeal into advocacy, speaking out for women whose lives were dismissed because of addiction, sex work, or marginalization. Through interviews and talks, she emphasized that recognition is the first form of protection. They have to matter before they're missed, she said. Her resilience reframed the narrative from mere survival to reclamation of worth. Law enforcement agencies across New Mexico implemented training to spot patterns of coercion and prioritize missing adult reports. The case highlighted that bureaucracy could either safeguard or erase people. Officers who once dismissed disappearances as voluntary began approaching them through trauma-informed frameworks. In this quiet shift, the legacy of the Toy Box Killer turned from fear into reform, from nightmares into vigilance. Psychologists studying Ray's methods drew lessons that extended beyond criminal behavior. His meticulous detachment resembled organizational pathology, how rigid structure can normalize harm when empathy is absent. In lectures, they used his trailer as metaphor, a sealed, ordered environment designed to eliminate conscience. Such reasoning, they warned, can infect institutions that prioritize efficiency over humanity. Ray's cruelty was extreme, but its foundation, dehumanization through process, exists in subtler forms everywhere. For families of missing women, remembrance became resistance. Community organizations hold annual vigils near Elephant Butte, reading names even when identities remain unconfirmed. Most belong to women's society undervalued in life and nearly erased in death. Under the desert sky, candles shine as acts of visibility, reclaiming what silence sought to erase. Each year, new attendees arrive not to sensationalize, but to insist that empathy can prevent tragedy. Cindy Hendy remains an ambiguous figure in this legacy. Her cooperation helped convict Ray, yet her participation raises enduring questions about complicity under coercion. Criminologists cite her as a study in moral drift, the slow erosion of resistance through exposure. Her story illustrates a hard truth. Evil rarely recruits ideology. It cultivates obedience until participation feels inevitable. Over time, Ray's former property shifted from landmark of terror to research subject. Portions of the trailer were preserved in secure facilities for forensic training. Investigators use it to teach recruits how obsession with order can conceal depravity, demonstrating that the cleanest crime scenes are often the most meticulously planned. In broader culture, the Toy Box Killer became shorthand for hidden monstrosity. But reducing his story to legend risks blunting its lesson. The true horror was logistical, a man using patience, planning, and procedural mastery to turn control itself into cruelty. Understanding that pattern helps society recognize danger earlier in workplaces, relationships, or institutions where unchecked authority thrives. For the survivors, life became reconstruction rather than recovery. Therapy, advocacy, and anonymity coexist as coping mechanisms. Years later, Cynthia Vigil reflected, "I'm not what he did. I'm what lived after." Her words have closed countless interviews, defining the human victory his system could never calculate. The lessons of this case remain uncomfortable but essential. Monsters aren't supernatural. They are methodical. They thrive in disbelief, in the spaces where victims are ignored and rules go unexamined. Elephant Butte's quiet shoreline bears no visible scar today, yet its emptiness reminds visitors of the vigilance ordinary life demands. The story of the toy box killer ends not with his death, but with an enduring question. How many warnings must society ignore before it acts? Because the next hidden chamber may not exist in a trailer, it may lie wherever indifference meets opportunity, waiting only for someone to notice the lock that should never have been there. Welcome back again. Please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is. Feel free to like the video too. Let's get to it. In 1940s London, people vanished without leaving a trace. Their homes were sold, their belongings forged away, and their bodies gone. No blood, no remains, just silence. How could anyone erase a person so completely? This is the story of John George High, the man who believed acid was the perfect solution to murder. But why did a petty fraudster suddenly transform into a calculating killer who thought he'd found the ultimate loophole? The answer lies not just in the acid baths, but in his mind, twisted, desperate, and shockingly logical. How could the quiet son of religious parents grow into one of Britain's most infamous killers? John George High was born in Stamford, Lincolnshire, in 1909, into a household that belonged to the Plymouth Brethren. This sect held to an extreme form of separation from the outside world. Members were taught strict discipline, with little allowance for outside pleasure or casual social ties. Children raised in such an environment often grew up removed from normal friendships, and High's childhood was marked by this same boundary. The community believed in hard work, obedience, and fear of worldly corruption. For a boy like High, daily life was structured and heavily supervised, and ordinary pastimes that seemed harmless in other families were discouraged or condemned. He later claimed that, as a child, he was plagued by recurring nightmares, often describing visions of blood and strange, dreamlike horrors. Stories of those nightmares added a darker undertone to a boyhood already set against a rigid religious background. Despite that, he seemed outwardly talented and even refined. High developed a strong interest in music, and he learned to play the piano with skill. His taste leaned toward classical pieces, and people who knew him as a young man sometimes described him as cultured. He attended concerts and seemed to appreciate the arts in a way that many of his peers did not. Music gave him a mask of sophistication, and in social settings, it was easy for others to see him as an urbane, pleasant presence. By appearance and manners, there was little to suggest the trouble underneath. In many respects, that outward charm would later become one of his main tools for deception. He looked and sounded like a man who could be trusted, even admired. But trust in High would always be misplaced. Behind the display of culture, High showed a pattern of dishonesty from an early age. One of the first significant incidents came when he was just 21. He lost a job after being suspected of taking money from a cash box. It was never proved in court, but the suspicion alone was enough to cost him employment and cast light on his careless attitude toward honesty. Friends and family may have looked on this episode as a mistake or indiscretion, but in truth, it was an early glimpse of his willingness to take what did not belong to him. Small dishonesty, if repeated, can become a kind of rehearsal for larger fraud, and for High, that appeared to be the pattern. It was not long after this that he turned to forgery, making false car documents and attempting to profit by trickery. Forgery was not recklessness alone, but an act of careful deceit. It implied planning, patient handwriting, and a cold recognition that other people's losses would become his gain. The contrast was stark. On the one hand, he presented himself as controlled, clean-cut, with polished skill at the piano and a taste for respectable company. On the other, he carried out thefts and false dealings that showed disregard for law and social obligation. Many later psychologists who studied similar cases have pointed to the role of childhood experiences in shaping this path. A strict and isolating religious environment can leave children feeling cut off from natural development, where guilt and secrecy take the place of openness. For some individuals, this can feed resentment or create a hidden world of fantasy and deception. High's vivid dreams and early acts of fraud fit such a pattern. They showed how one could lead a double existence, balancing the outward expectation of a devout upbringing with a growing taste for manipulation. Research into deviant behavior notes that extreme parental control often prevents children from developing skills to handle conflict in normal ways. Instead of trust and open dialogue, the child learns to conceal, to lie, and to satisfy desires out of sight. High's case is a textbook example of this process. While his parents enforced moral lessons and separation, he learned something different: the art of hiding. He began to use charm, music, and polished manners to project normalcy, but his real tendencies leaked through every act of fraud he tried. The unsettled question is whether his disturbing nightmares reflected his own guilt, or were fragments of violent imagination that would later spill into his crimes. Either way, they fed into a sense of self-alienation. As he grew older, the mask of culture and skill covered a restless urge to trick and take. By the time he reached adulthood, the cracks were obvious. Losing jobs for dishonesty, forging documents, and deceiving others were not isolated mistakes but signs of habit. It was not only a matter of breaking rules for quick profit, it showed a deeper pattern of valuing lies as a tool. Fraud, for High, was not an occasional shortcut but a lifestyle in the making. Music and charm gained him trust, while his hands quietly wrote false papers or rifled through cash boxes. This habit of gaining a surface reputation while running a hidden scheme would follow him into every later stage of life. What might look like duality, respectability at the front and crime in the shadow, was in fact his chosen way of living. To him, deception was not a last resort, but the easiest and most natural option. Seeing him this way helps explain how he could rise from suspected theft in his 20s to fraud cases that destroyed his early marriage and sent him behind bars. The socially acceptable surface remained vital. Without his performance of respectability, his frauds would not have worked. But when he was caught, the disgrace was total. In time, instead of abandoning trickery, he doubled down, perfecting the skill of faking documents, identities, and appearances. Many people born into strict and isolating surroundings struggle to balance cultural expectations with personal urges, yet only some turn that conflict into lifelong deception. High, by his own early acts and his disturbing imagination, showed himself to be one of them. The childhood haunted by harsh rules and strange nightmares planted in him a secret life of fraud, and that secret life only grew when he stepped into adulthood. Those early warning signs, dishonesty, deception, forged papers, suspected theft, were not trivial mistakes. They were the beginning of the path that would later widen into murder. What happens when lies catch up before a man even turns 30? For John High, the answer came quickly, and it cost him both his marriage and his freedom. In July 1934, he married a young woman named Beatrice Betty Hamer, and for a brief time, it looked as though he might follow a more conventional path. Yet stability was never something he could maintain. Just months into the marriage, his double life as a fraudster surfaced. Arrest and conviction followed, and while he was serving his sentence, Betty gave birth to their daughter. The child was placed for adoption soon after, and High never saw either of them again. The marriage effectively dissolved before the ink on the certificate was dry. This was not just a personal setback. It cut him off from the traditional family ties that might have anchored him, leaving only isolation and growing resentment. The conviction that landed him in prison for the first time was tied to forgery, the same habit he had honed in his early years. High had been falsifying documents for cars, a bold but sloppy operation that collapsed under scrutiny. Once inside prison, he met the reality of a British penal system designed to punish rather than reform. Inmates lived in overcrowded and austere conditions, stripped of individuality and subjected to routines aimed at deterrence. There was little in the way of rehabilitation programs, and men are often left as hardened criminals rather than reformed citizens. For High, the experience did not so much scare him straight as it did sharpen his sense of grievance and his interest in deception as a career. Prison yards and bleak cells had their own hierarchy. To survive, one either kept one's head down or found ways to adapt. High adapted, but in his case, he did not turn to humility. He learned instead how criminals spoke, how they carried themselves, and how prison hardened them to pity or regret. He was a quick observer, cataloguing what gained respect and what made someone appear weak. In that social climate, remorse was unfashionable. Cunning, however, could make a man stand out. Although he lacked physical toughness, He compensated with plans, schemes, and a presentation of intelligence that some others lacked. For Betty, the consequences were immediate and lasting. She had married expecting security, but instead soon found herself a single mother whose child had been put up for adoption. To distance herself from disgrace, she separated from Hai completely. Hai's family, already troubled by his behavior, took steps to sever ties as well. He emerged from prison not only without a wife or child, but also without parental support. His place in society had drastically shifted in just a few years. Where once he was the polished young man who could play piano and charm acquaintances, he was now a marked fraudster, with no career, no family, and a record hanging over him. That loss of social standing mattered because it set the stage for his growing reliance on schemes to regain what he had squandered. By 1936, Hai had quietly shifted to new ground in London. At first glance, this looked like opportunity. In reality, he carried with him a ruined reputation. Wartime Britain was a country where trust and rationing shaped daily life. Jobs were scarce, communities knew one another closely, and someone with a prison sentence behind them stood out quickly. Hai compensated by hiding his past and inventing new identities. His move to London gave him anonymity, but it also kept him away from whatever small connections might have reminded him of stability. London was vast, crowded, and filled with chances to disappear into the background. For someone like Hai, it was an environment that encouraged testing boundaries. Hai later found employment as a chauffeur with William McSwan, who ran amusement arcades. Being near wealthy individuals fed his appetite for comfort and money, and it was here he saw firsthand what kind of lifestyle wealth could give. It also showed him how fraud could be scaled. He began copying the manners and speech of the people riding in the back of the cars he drove. He did not just watch, he studied, and he realized financial fraud could offer him more than car forgeries ever could. By creating convincing paperwork and presenting himself with confidence, he could trick people who believed they were dealing with a respectable man. That realization became the blueprint he carried into his next schemes. Not long after, he adopted the name William Cato Adamson, falsely presenting himself as a solicitor. With this role, he set up what looked like legal offices in Surrey, London, and Sussex. The mask was convincing enough for clients, who believed they were buying shares from estates of deceased people. In truth, the estates were fabricated, and the paperwork was entirely forged. Here, Hai advanced in sophistication. It was no longer a petty forgery of car registrations. Now, it was an entire fictional business, complete with false offices and documents. The irony is that such confidence sometimes created vulnerability. When you assume greater risk, a single oversight can undo everything. Just as before, his mistake was basic, an error in spelling that exposed the forgery. The word Guildford was written as Guildford in these official letters, and from there, the unravelling was swift. The exposure led to another 4-year prison sentence. This was no short stay, and the longer punishment deepened his estrangement from regular society. Wartime conditions made this even sharper. While ordinary men his age were conscripted or working in vital industries, Hay spent those years marked as a fraudster and inmate. To the outside world, he was absent, his name linked to disgrace. Psychologists who study criminal behavior often observe that repeated imprisonment can harden identity. When a man returns to prison again and again, he can start to see himself as beyond ordinary life, someone permanently outside society's rules. That outlook then justifies the next crime. For Hai, this repeated cycle meant he no longer saw crime as risk. He began to see it as the only path available. Inside prison walls, he continued to refine his methods. Letters, signatures, documents, each became practice for him, with small details to correct for the next run. He learned how to speak like someone in power. He realized the value of small signs of status, like polished speech or correct phrasing on legal documents. Being locked away gave him the time to study and plan. When he stepped out, he was not shamed or humbled, but more determined than before. His criminal identity had been molded and reinforced, not erased. By the time he walked free again, the world outside had changed. Britain was at war, rationing had taken hold, and families were often disrupted by loss and absence. These conditions mattered because they created new gaps to exploit. Disruptions in records, hurried transactions, and distracted authorities meant that sharp fraudsters had more room to maneuver. Hai saw opportunity. Isolation at home, combined with damaged reputation, had left him little chance to reintegrate. A man who had failed at marriage, been severed from his family, and recognized as a fraud inside the prison system, now stood at a crossroads in a fractured society. He did not choose to rebuild. He chose instead to adapt his earlier tricks to a city teeming with possibility. London became the stage where his past dishonesty and growing ambition would merge into something darker. The line between fraud and violence was about to blur. He was no longer satisfied with simply falsifying estates or taking money through forged papers. His next steps would show how fraud, when paired with desperation and cold calculation, could escalate into something far more deadly. How could a misspelled word bring down a con artist's entire empire? For John George Hay, that single blunder exposed a scheme he had built with patience and precision. By the mid-1930s, fresh out of prison and trying to reinvent himself yet again, he came to London under a new name. This time, he did not choose the path of a petty forger or car salesman. He went bigger. Hay adopted the identity of William Cato Adamson, presenting himself as a solicitor with offices spread across London, Surrey, Guildford and Hastings. On letterheads, on business cards, and in every manner of correspondence, he was no longer a disgraced man with a prison record. He was a figure of law, someone who could be trusted to handle paperwork, money, and complicated arrangements. That kind of disguise required commitment. It also required confidence. He had both, at least until his own carelessness chipped it away. To build the illusion, Hay furnished offices, hired secretaries when needed, and even used professional stationery that bore the name Adamson in heavy print. Clients walked in and saw tidy rooms, desks stacked with papers, and folders that carried the marks of official legal business. He presented himself with formality, wore the right clothes, and adopted the speech patterns of men educated in law. One detail that always worked for him was his manner. He knew how to sound convincing, even when pressed with questions. That polish, combined with the office facade, gave him a credibility that many desperate clients did not think to test. A solicitor with multiple offices could handle the complicated matters of estate law. Or at least, that was the image he created. The scheme itself was not crude. Hay claimed he had access to estates of wealthy clients who had died without heirs. Through supposed legal loopholes, shares from these estates could be transferred at discounted prices. To uninformed investors or family contacts, this sounded appealing. Why deal with the red tape of normal channels if a trusted solicitor could quietly sell you privileged assets? Hay understood that it was easier to fool people when they felt like they were stepping into something exclusive. Secrecy always added value. Most of his customers were convinced enough to hand over cash, secure in the belief that they were investing wisely. In reality, every estate was fabricated. The assets only existed on paper, drafted and signed by Hay's hand. With enough forged seals, letterheads, and formal phrasing, the documents looked official. It was a scam run with sophistication, an operation far beyond the car forgeries of his earlier years. For all its polish, his empire had one flaw. On some of his official papers, Hay typed the name of the town Guildford as Guildford. To almost any eye, the slip might seem small, but in legal correspondence, especially documents tied to properties and estates, accuracy was everything. A single inconsistency could raise suspicion, and that is exactly what happened. Someone caught the spelling error, and in that overlooked detail, the deception unraveled. Investigators realized the mistake signaled something larger, that the solicitor's papers were not genuine. If a man working under the name of William Cato Adamson could not even spell Guildford correctly, what else was false? Hay's carefully built front collapsed quickly. The authorities dug into his operations, and it became clear that the solicitor's identity was an invention. None of the estates were real. The clients who supposedly left behind stocks and assets had never existed. All of it was lines of ink on paper, no more legitimate than the car forgeries that had first placed him in trial years earlier. This time, though, the scope was greater, and so was the punishment. The court sentenced him to 4 years in prison for fraud. Another stretch behind walls awaited him. By 1939, when Britain prepared for war, Hay was yet again in custody. His dreams of carving out a respectable appearance in society through deceit had been exposed. At the time, prison was not a mild experience. Long hours, little comfort, and rigid rules wore on men. Rehabilitation in any true sense was absent. The system emphasized order, punishment, and containment. Inmates like Hay were made to face the monotony of confinement, with scarce opportunity for actual training or reintegration. Yet for him, prison became another classroom. The 4 years were not wasted from his point of view. They gave him long stretches of time to think, to plan, and to refine. He practiced drafting letters that read more professionally. He studied how flaws in his approach, like the spelling mistake, could betray him, Instead of regarding forgery as something to adjust, he began to treat it as a craft, an art form where precision meant survival. More than his skills with paperwork, prison hardened his outlook. He entered blaming chance and lapses of detail. He left seeing fraud as his true calling. In that hardened view, respectability in normal work was no longer an option. To him, deception was not a side road but the main path forward. He looked at businessmen, landlords and officials, not as respectable people but as future marks. He absorbed lessons from others inside, men who shared their own stories of scams, robberies, or ways of cheating the system. In place of reform, he found education. For someone with his natural charm and ability to present as refined, the combination was potent. Looking back, this prison term stands out not only for the fraud itself, but for what it represented. It showed how far Hai was willing to go to invent an entire life, complete with legal offices, false estates, and fabricated shares. It also revealed a growing arrogance. To impersonate a solicitor is to assume the trust of one of the most respected professions, and by the time of his exposure, he seemed confident he could keep the game running without flaws. Confidence is often the undoing of men like him. A word misspelled, a careless slip, became enough to undo everything. But when the walls closed in, Hai did not learn restraint. He learned only to be sharper next time. As war raged outside during his incarceration, Hai watched as the world shifted. Families lost members, records were disordered, and chaos stretched across Britain. He recognized that future opportunities would emerge from this disorder. Where others saw tragedy, he saw advantage. That kind of mindset, viewing crisis as a chance to manipulate, would guide him when free again. Fraud alone had proved profitable, but it also had limits. Prison was the price of getting caught. He began thinking of ways to erase risk entirely, not stop playing the game but change the rules. If victims could vanish without evidence, then forged documents would look stronger and questions would fade. He no longer considered mistakes like the Guildford slip as fatal, but as signs to close loopholes. By the time he was preparing for release, Hay was not the man who first stepped into London with an alias. He was more practiced, more resentful, and more determined. The title of solicitor had been stolen to mask deception, and paperwork had proven useful, but fraud alone was becoming too fragile. His next stage would combine the paperwork tricks, the falsified records, and the charm with something more final. Instead of relying on lies alone, he would soon rely on murder, pairing fraud with physical erasure. In his mind, to eliminate risk from fraud meant to eliminate people. That leap is what awaited him once he left the prison walls behind. How could someone disappear during wartime Britain without raising alarm? In the summer of 1944, the country was still in the grip of air raids, rationing, and the disruption that came with a global conflict. In that climate, people moved in and out of cities constantly, and news of missing individuals could often pass without immediate concern. John George Hai understood this, and he saw in it an opening to cover his tracks. He had already lived as a fraudster, creating false identities and official-looking documents, but now he was ready for something new. The frauds alone had brought him money and time in prison, but prison taught him how fragile those plans really were. He wanted a way to keep the profits, but erase the risk of discovery. In his mind, the solution was simple. No victim meant no crime could be proven. Hai knew who his first target would be. William Donald McSwan was not a stranger. Years earlier, Hai had worked as a chauffeur for his father, Donald McSwan, who ran in wealthy circles through his business in amusement arcades. During that time, Hai became acquainted with William. By 1944, McSwan was a man of means, benefiting from his parents' successful business and owning properties that brought in a steady flow of rent. To a man like Hai, who now moved in and out of schemes but never held on to wealth, McSwan looked like the perfect starting point. And wartime Britain, with its chaos and populations constantly shifting, gave cover to what he planned next. In September 1944, Hai arranged a reunion with McSwan. He was charming, as usual, presenting himself as a friend interested in catching up. The meeting took place at a basement property on Gloucester Road, a location away from the watchful eyes of neighbours or passers-by. What McSwan did not know was that Hai had already brought a heavy lead pipe with him. The trap was set before McSwan even arrived. When the moment came, Hai struck him fatally. There was no dramatic chase or drawn-out fight. Quick violence, then silence. By killing him in the basement, Hai had chosen privacy from the start. But the real method for covering up the crime was yet to come. What followed turned his fraud into something altogether different. At the property, Hai kept a large 40-gallon steel drum, and inside it, He poured concentrated sulfuric acid. This acid was extremely corrosive, capable of burning through skin and dissolving flesh at a frightening pace. When used in sufficient amounts, it could reduce an entire body to liquid. High placed McSwan's body into the drum, covered it with acid, and left the chemical process to begin. Within 2 days, most of the body had been broken down, reduced to a dark sludge. For the final step, High tipped the remains into a manhole nearby. Where others might bury or burn a body and leave traces, High left nothing that could be recovered. For him, this was the clean solution, the loophole to erase not only the victim, but the crime itself. It was this act that marked the turning point in his life of crime. He had shifted from forgeries and frauds, where victims left behind complaints and charges, to a crime where he believed victims left nothing at all. This reasoning gave him justification in his own mind. To High, murder was only an extension of fraud. The death of the victim meant no lawsuit, no charges, and no paper trail to undo his plans. It was deception taken to the final step. In his twisted logic, it was not just violence for its own sake, it was removing the evidence. To him, it was efficient, and above all, safe. After the act, he faced the challenge of explaining McSwan's absence. Here, the wartime conditions worked in his favour. High told McSwan's parents that their son had gone away to Scotland, hiding out to avoid being called up for military service. At the time, draft evasion was not a rare excuse. Families knew men who had run, deserted, or quietly disappeared to avoid the fighting abroad. For the McSwans, alive in a country stretched thin by conscription, this was plausible. They did not go to the police, and they accepted High's word. That simple lie gave him breathing room to step into William's affairs. Once McSwan was out of the picture, High moved to secure his rents and properties. Payments once directed to William now flowed under High's control. He forged documents when needed, collecting the money with ease. The fraud was the same scheme he had run before, but now without the risk of the victim showing up to expose it. McSwan's absence was explained away, his body dissolved, and High found himself holding funds that gave him freedom. The combination seemed to prove his theory correct. Fraud, combined with murder, was safer than fraud alone. Still, this crime should not be understood as an act of desperation only. It was also an experiment. High wanted to see if his acid method would truly erase every trace. He proved to himself it could. By the time the manhole carried away the last of McSwan's remains, only small fragments lingered, a detail he brushed aside as negligible. He had watched the acid work, and he trusted it. The man who had once been cautious about signatures and spelling mistakes now saw no limit. Acid had given him a way to erase evidence completely, far more decisive than shredding papers or hiding documents. He believed he had found the perfect solution. Wartime Britain was a strange landscape to test such a crime. Blackouts left streets dark at night. Neighbours were absent for long stretches of time, and government focus leaned heavily on keeping the country running under attack. Missing individuals could get lost in the chaos, especially younger men who might be explained away as draft evaders. High played directly into that environment. The timing helped him. Had it been peacetime, a wealthy man vanishing from London might have sparked faster questions. But in 1944, the country was stretched thin, and those gaps made it easier for High to slip through unnoticed. This was not just a disappearance, it became the template for all his later crimes. Each element would return again: the lure into an isolated space, the fatal strike with confidence, the acid bath to erase the evidence, and the cover story provided to families or friends. Above all, it proved to him that he could not only profit, but do so without fear of trial. The rules had changed in his eyes. Fraud had limits, but fraud tied to murder had none. For William Donald McSwan, the meeting at Gloucester Road was the last time he was seen alive. For John George High, it was the first time killing merged seamlessly with forgery. His calm after the crime, his ability to convince McSwan's parents of the false story, and his ease at collecting rents showed how quickly he adapted. He believed he had unlocked a method beyond discovery, and once the first attempt succeeded, nothing held him back from repeating it. Each success would only strengthen his certainty, moving him beyond a single victim to something larger, darker, and more ambitious. Why stop at one victim when silence meant more money? After William McSwan vanished without a trace, his parents, Donald and Amy McSwan, began pressing High for answers. They asked about their son and wanted to know where he had gone. High had already told them William had left to avoid being called up for military service, but the story was not enough to calm their questions. Every time he saw them, they wanted updates. For a man like High, who thrived on having control over his victims, their persistence was a problem. He realized that silence would only come if the McSwans themselves were removed completely. Unlike William, they were older, but their property, wealth, and London holdings made them targets. In High's view, their disappearance would solve two problems at once: end the questions and create even greater financial opportunity. The McSwans were owners of several properties in London, and William had been collecting rent on their behalf before his disappearance. That meant not only steady income but assets that could be transferred or sold. High had tasted the benefits of controlling William's financial affairs after his death, but to secure the full amount, he needed access to the whole portfolio. Donald and Amy stood in his way. Their wealth represented security, and their age made them less likely to escape or resist if approached carefully. More importantly, they trusted High. They knew him through their son, and in wartime Britain, close ties like these meant a great deal. He presented himself as helpful, polite, and concerned. Their guard was down, and Hay knew how to exploit that trust without hesitation. In September 1944, High lured Donald McSwan on false pretenses. He invited him to his basement workshop, just as he had done with William. For Donald, nothing seemed unusual. High was someone he knew, and the setting was presented as businesslike. Once inside, High struck swiftly. Just as he had with William, he attacked with a blunt instrument, choosing speed and privacy over confrontation. When Donald had been killed, High placed the body into a 40-gallon drum filled with sulfuric acid. He had tested this method already, and he trusted it. Over the course of 2 days, the acid worked to dissolve the body into a thick liquid. When the process finished, High disposed of the remains into a manhole, once again eliminating physical evidence. With Donald gone, High turned his focus to Amy. He knew she would soon ask questions when her husband failed to come home. For that reason, he acted quickly, contacting her with a false story that Donald had been delayed and asking her to meet. Believing the explanation, Amy followed him back to his workshop. Like her husband, she was struck down as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Her body was placed into a second drum of acid, and the process repeated. 2 members of the same family had vanished in the same week. High had eliminated not just William, but his parents as well, giving him access to everything they controlled. The escalation from 1 victim to 3 exposed his growing dependence on murder as an extension of fraud. The pattern was as cold as it was deliberate. High killed each victim in isolation, reused the same method, and then erased the evidence with acid. He relied on 2 things: privacy and trust. Both Donald and Amy walked into his workshop believing him, and once the drums were closed, they never walked out again. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly High repeated his process. Even with 2 corpses dissolving in drums, he was already thinking ahead about property transfers and the paper trail that would help him maintain control. While other men his age were fighting in the war or working to support families, Hay was standing alone in a basement, surrounded by chemical fumes, planning the next step in seizing their money. With both parents gone, High turned to paperwork. He forged signatures, created documents, and transferred assets as if Donald and Amy had willingly passed control. It was not a simple matter of carrying cash, but a coordinated effort to produce convincing records. Property deeds, signatures, and legal forms were his tools, just as much as the lead pipe and sulfuric acid were. By presenting the forgeries with authority, he managed to access their wealth quietly. In total, he gained around £8,000. This was a significant amount in wartime Britain, giving him luxury beyond rationing. He also collected belongings of value, including furniture, jewellery, and their car. In one particularly chilling act of normalcy, he even kept their dog as his own. To an outsider, he now appeared to be a man moving up in life, driving a better car, wearing finer clothes, and carrying himself with more wealth. The disappearance of the McSwans raised no immediate alarm. Wartime London was chaotic, and people vanished often. Evacuations, conscription, and the general dislocation of families gave room for excuses. Neighbours who might have asked questions assumed movements were connected to the war effort. With William supposedly hiding in Scotland and Donald and Amy absent, there was nothing obvious to trace back to High. His cover stories continued to work, and the acid left nothing physical behind that could draw suspicion. For him, the crime validated his theory. Fraud on its own was never safe enough, but fraud coupled with murder and chemical disposal left no loose ends. High now had money to spend, and he spent it freely. Expensive suits replaced the old ones. Better food, drinks, and entertainment became part of his routine. He drove the McSwan's car, treating it as his own. People around him saw wealth and assumed business success. The truth, however, was that every penny came from a family erased from existence. What made the crime distinctive was the scale of the escalation. From one young man, Hai had leapt to wiping out his entire family. By targeting the parents along with the son, he showed there was no limit to what he would attempt if profit was at stake. This was not reactionary killing out of panic. These were deliberate murders carried out to gain wealth. The success of the plan reinforced his confidence. He had proven to himself that acid baths could hide bodies completely, that forged signatures could stand up to scrutiny, and that people would believe convenient stories in wartime. He had money, assets, and independence, all built on death. Importantly, he learned that silencing families was more profitable than killing individuals. Eliminating one victim left behind others to ask questions. Eliminating all directly involved made the questions stop. This lesson would guide his future decisions. He no longer thought in terms of single marks, but in terms of entire families, especially those wealthy enough to be worth the risk. As he enjoyed the profits, one other factor became apparent. Greed has no final limit. The £8,000 and belongings bought him time, but they did not satisfy him permanently. Within months, he began thinking about wealthier targets and grander schemes. If dissolving 3 people could secure him properties and money, what could 5 or 6 bring? The McSwan's disappearance marked a turning point, not just in his crimes, but in his ambition. Hay was no longer a fraudster disguising theft with papers. He was now a man who believed murder was simply a tool to manage his fraud. Every disappearance gave him more confidence, and every financial gain pushed him to consider wealthier and more connected victims. From that point onward, financial ambition and violence were inseparable in his life. Hay had confirmed for himself that his method worked, and the profits demanded more. The next step was inevitable. If the McSwan's properties made him rich, wealthier couples and more valuable estates were waiting. He had moved from fraud into systematic murder for gain, building his life on the silence of his victims, and in the years that followed, his schemes only grew larger. Why would a serial fraudster risk everything by targeting a well-connected couple? In the years after the McSwan murders, John Hay was living beyond his means. Wartime crime had covered some of his disappearances, but by 1947, the economy was shifting. Rationing tightened, people looked more closely at transactions, and smaller frauds did not bring in enough to keep his lifestyle afloat. He wanted comfort, the feel of wealth, and the respect that came with money. It was not just about quick profit anymore. He craved the security and luxury owned by people above his station. That desire led him to Archibald and Rosalie Henderson, a couple with money, connections, and valuable property. They seemed out of reach to most swindlers. To Hay, they were the next step in a growing pattern. Hay met the Hendersons through a blend of charm and business posturing. He presented himself as a property dealer, someone with professional skill who could advise on real estate. At the time, property was one of the most reliable investments available. The war had left much of London bomb damaged, and rebuilding efforts made property dealings lucrative. Families who held worthwhile homes or land often attracted people like Hay, who claimed to have opportunities waiting. He leaned on respectability, the tailored suits, careful manners, and legal-style documents that persuaded people to see him as reliable. The Hendersons were comfortable in social circles, but they also wanted to make wise financial choices. They accepted Hay's company, and he began spending more time in their presence to deepen that trust. One detail from these encounters stood out later. While visiting the Hendersons, Hay noticed Archibald's revolver. Firearms were unusual in Britain, tightly controlled but not impossible to possess by men of means. Hay quickly understood that the weapon could play 2 roles. It was tangible proof of Archibald's wealth, and useful as a tool for murder. On a visit, Hay quietly slipped it away, keeping it for himself. It was a small theft, but it carried major weight. That revolver would ultimately serve as the instrument in taking both of their lives. The theft also showed how direct Hay had become. Unlike earlier forgeries or staged papers, this was plain stealing from under his target's nose. It was a step that showed his growing boldness and his comfort in taking risks around people who trusted him. By February of 1948, John George Hay had laid his plan. He rented another workspace in Crawley, Sussex. This workshop was isolated, a quiet unit where he stored drums of sulfuric acid, tools, and supplies. It was not his home or daily place of visible business, which made it ideal for what he was planning. With this setup ready, Hay invited the Hendersons there under the guise of discussing property opportunities. They believed they were meeting a respectable businessman about real estate. There was no reason for them to suspect danger. The setting was private, but disguised as legitimate, the kind of place one might expect for confidential financial talks. High had designed the trap as carefully as he had with William and the McSwans. Inside the Crawley workshop, the couple faced a fatal betrayal. High used the revolver he had stolen from Archibald, shooting them each at close range. If earlier victims had been struck with blunt instruments before being dissolved in acid, this time High executed the plan with a firearm. It was faster, quieter in terms of resistance, and left him with greater control over their bodies in the aftermath. Once they were dead, he returned to the method he had now refined, lowering the bodies into drums of concentrated sulfuric acid. Over 2 days, the acid reduced flesh and tissue to liquid sludge, leaving only traces of bone or dentures. As before, he disposed of the remains through drains and back areas near his workshop. For High, that workshop was a controlled laboratory where crime could hide behind locked doors. Once the Hendersons ceased to exist physically, High turned to the financial side. The real purpose of targeting them lay in their assets. This was not a random killing. It was designed entirely for gain. Through forged signatures and falsified paperwork, High transferred their belongings to himself. He gained access to their home in West London, their car, jewellery, and other possessions. The fraud followed a similar script as before, but the scale was much greater. High was no longer targeting the holdings of one young man or an elderly couple with modest rentals. He was taking over assets that signified high wealth. This gave him not just money, but a stronger appearance of legitimacy. Outsiders might see him occupying a wealthy couple's residence, driving their car, and conclude he was truly a successful businessman. It was the image he had always wanted to project. Financial pressure drove these risks. By 1947 and 1948, High had spent through much of the McSwan money. His taste for comfort demanded more. His willingness to escalate showed how greed had merged with murder into one continuous cycle. Fraud on its own could not support him. There was always the chance of being exposed by surviving victims. Murder solved that, in his mind, and the Hendersons looked like the right prize. It was his belief that acid eliminated all risk. He counted on there being no bodies, no crime that the law could prove, and no challenges to his forged documents. In that belief, he extended his frauds from middle-class estates to the world of wealthy property owners. Logistics were vital in making this possible. A house or a hotel room could never provide the privacy to dissolve bodies in acid. Neighbours, staff, and cleaners would notice fumes, stains, and unusual containers. The workshops he rented in locations like Crawley became essential. They allowed him to set up drums, store equipment, and lock himself away without interference. Sulfuric acid gave off strong fumes, and only a secluded space could conceal this. These workshops doubled as both crime scenes and laboratories, where careful handling of acid and timing allowed for complete erasure of victims. Without such spaces, his cycle of fraud and murder would have collapsed quickly. The Henderson murders symbolized the peak of High's arrogance. He was no longer content to swindle through letters and forged signatures alone. He inserted himself into the lives of wealthy, socially connected people, then removed them with violence and converted their lives into assets under his name. This combination of charm in public, violence in private, and forged paperwork afterwards defined his method. It was fraud evolved into murder for profit, supported by workshops that hid acid drums in the shadows of ordinary English towns. To him, it proved he could take down not just vulnerable individuals, but couples with standing, money, and social ties. Yet success carried its own hidden dangers. The bolder the target, the more noticeable their disappearance. While wartime conditions had hidden earlier vanishing acts, post-war Britain was less forgiving. Friends, neighbours, and relatives began asking more questions when wealthy couples dropped out of sight. For High, however, the Hendersons embodied the lure of high reward. Their loss gave him greater assets in the short term, but it also showed how his reliance on workshops and acid would have to remain perfectly managed if he hoped to continue. His method had become consistent, but his ambition kept pushing him toward riskier victims. And in time, that ambition would lead him to the victim whose disappearance finally broke the illusion that no trace could be left behind. What kind of place could hide both acid baths and human remains? For John George Hay, the answer came in the form of rented workshops, out-of-the-way buildings that attracted little attention. These were not grand offices or ordinary homes. They were modest spaces, large enough to store industrial equipment, but quiet enough to allow him to work unnoticed. The first of these was located on Gloucester Road in London. To those who passed by, it looked like any ordinary workroom, but inside it became the site where William McSwan and his parents met their deaths, their bodies lowered into drums of sulfuric acid. From the outside, nothing gave it away. No screaming sounds seeped through the walls, and no suspicious smoke poured out of the windows. The exterior promised only routine labor, yet what went on inside defined one of the most chilling crime methods of the 1940s. Later, after moving his focus away from Gloucester Road, High settled on another hidden space in Crawley, Sussex. That site became equally important, especially during his attacks on Archibald and Rosalie Henderson. The Crawley workshop was nondescript, little more than a rented unit with solid walls and a lockable door. For High, this was ideal. These properties had none of the built-in risks of hotels or boarding houses, where managers and cleaning staff would be quick to notice large containers filled with dangerous chemicals. Instead, the workshop offered privacy, and with privacy came the opportunity to carry out and conceal serious crimes. To anyone else walking by, it was a site for tradesmen, mechanics, or small-time business owners. To Hay, it was a laboratory designed for erasing human beings. Managing these crimes required detail and planning. Sulfuric acid is highly corrosive, but it does not behave cleanly. It smokes, it gives off a sharp smell, and it corrodes the objects it touches. For High to use it, he needed containers that would hold both acid and the bodies he wanted to destroy. This is why he favoured 40-gallon steel drums. They were large enough to contain an adult body when folded inside, and sturdy enough to withstand the acid without breaking apart too quickly. Once a victim was submerged, he left the process to work over 1 or 2 days, letting the body break down into sludge. When the remains were liquid, he simply poured them down nearby drains or manholes. The workshops came equipped with drainage systems designed for waste disposal. To a murderer with High's plan, that detail was a perfect way to hide evidence. Every step was practical, mechanical, and disturbingly simple. Think about the setting. Cramped walls, a steel drum in the middle of the floor, acid bubbling inside, and careful hands steering the final act of disposal. Unlike homes or offices, which held furniture and decoration, the workshop stripped everything to bare function. There were no neighbours sharing a corridor, no cleaners checking bins, no guests dropping by unannounced. Hay could take his time. Each detail of his crimes relied on this freedom. He could strike a victim quickly, haul the body to the drum, and leave it submerged behind a locked door. The fumes would have been overwhelming to most people, but High returned time and again, convinced his system was foolproof. Hotels or residential houses carried risks he could not afford. The constant movement of others, the likelihood of smells being noticed, and the obvious suspicion of dragging drums through common halls all made them impossible. With workshops, these problems vanished. He could transport drums in vehicles, roll them directly inside, and be assured that nobody would ask questions. Workspaces of that size often held unusual equipment anyway, so a steel drum looked unremarkable in that context. Employees of nearby workshops may have assumed High was storing chemicals or oils, both common for trades and repair work. It was the perfect disguise, because it required no disguise at all. His setup looked ordinary enough to blend seamlessly into the background of working-class industry. The timing also played in his favour. In the 1940s, public awareness of forensics was primitive by modern standards. Law enforcement officers understood fingerprints and basic cause of death, but chemical disposal of a body was beyond their routine expertise. There were no advanced DNA methods, no computer records tying missing person reports together in real time, and no rapid cross-referencing systems for financial fraud. That gap in scientific and bureaucratic oversight gave Hay confidence. He believed that once acid dissolved a body, there would be no evidence left for police to find. Without a corpse, he assumed no charge could be brought. That belief was not completely irrational at the time, since most prosecutions did rely on physical remains to prove a murder had taken place. He turned the lack of forensic sophistication into his greatest advantage. Of course, in reality, acid left residues, and certain materials like dentures and bones sometimes survived. But in 1944 or 1947, this was not fully understood by police on the ground. Trained pathologists might recognize fragments, but without a clear body, a murder case seemed fragile. High built his entire method on exploiting that weakness. Where other fraudsters tried to cover their paper trails, he went farther, covering the human trail that could lead the law back to him. These hidden workshops were not just storage sites. They became the machinery of his vanity, the places where he imagined himself untouchable, above law and detection. The Gloucester workshop carried the first lessons. 3 members of the McSwan family disappeared there, and when nothing remained to mark their deaths, High's confidence surged. The Crawley workshop expanded those lessons further. By then, he had settled into a rhythm: kill, dissolve, forge documents, and move into the victim's financial life as if it were his own. While others saw everyday toolhouses, he saw engines of wealth. Each cramped workspace allowed him to maintain his double image, polished and respectable on the surface, surrounded by acid drums and chemical fumes in private. Both workshops were critical to his cycle. Without them, his methods would have stood out in hotels, homes, or other public spaces where witnesses could ask questions. At the same time, the workshops show how isolation shaped his confidence. Locked away with only acid drums and forged documents, he convinced himself of perfection. The very absence of discovery fueled this self-deception. Months and years passed without arrest, reinforcing his belief. He imagined himself cleverer than the law, standing on ground others had never even considered. Every victim targeted at Gloucester or Crawley was chosen knowing that those spaces gave him control. And each time he poured the dissolved sludge into drains, he thought of it as the final proof that nothing of his crimes existed anymore. In that sense, the workshops were the heart of his fantasy, the stage where illusion met brutality. Yet success carried its own weakness. While he believed himself hidden, the very secrecy of the workshops meant nobody had seen his crimes until it was too late. It also meant that when one future victim drew attention, the entire system of concealment could fall apart in an instant. Acid drums, locked rooms, and chemical fumes might hide crimes for a time, but questions from the outside world never stay suppressed forever. The Gloucester and Crawley sites were havens while they lasted, but Hayes' pattern of control would eventually be pushed too far. He thought the workshops had made him invincible, yet soon he would choose a target whose disappearance could not be explained away so quietly. What happens when you kill someone who cannot so easily be explained away? For John George High, that moment arrived in 1949 with the disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon. Up until then, he had targeted victims who were either socially isolated or could plausibly be excused as having vanished in wartime confusion. But Olive was not one of those people. She was a 69-year-old widow, known within her community and surrounded by acquaintances who paid attention to her routines. Unlike the McSwans or Hendersons, Olive's disappearance was never going to pass without notice, and that difference is what cracked High's belief that acid baths could erase everything. Olive Durand Deacon lived in Kensington at the Onslow Court Hotel, the same lodging house where High resided. The hotel contained residents of comfortable financial means, people who relied on an atmosphere of safety and respectability. Olive herself had lived a measured, predictable life there, often socializing with other residents. She had a reputation for being practical, observant, and fairly active for her age. High, who posed as an engineer and inventor, used these interactions to draw her in. He often presented himself as someone developing new products or working on curious designs. That persona gave him credibility when he claimed he could help her with one of her own ideas. In early 1949, Olive approached High about a design she had for a new kind of artificial fingernail. It was a small innovation, but she believed it could be commercially viable. High encouraged her, telling her he had access to equipment and facilities where they could create prototypes. The idea suited him perfectly because it gave a natural excuse to lure her to his workshop away from the hotel. He suggested she accompany him to his space at Leopold Road in Crawley, where he supposedly kept the necessary tools. Olive, seeing him as a capable man with technical interests, agreed. On February 18th, 1949, Olive travelled with High to the workshop. Once inside, she never left alive. High used the Henderson's revolver, the pistol he had stolen during his earlier visits, to shoot her in the back of the neck. Unlike his first killing of William McSwan, this was not a strike with a blunt object, but a swift execution with a firearm. It was efficient, controlled, and gave him immediate dominance over the scene. After the gunshot, he placed her body into one of his drums filled with concentrated sulfuric acid, the same method he had been refining since 1944. Over the next 2 days, Olive's body was reduced to sludge, drained away through the workshop system. To High, it was routine by now. He had developed a pattern of lures, killings, and acid disposal. But this murder was different in ways he underestimated. Olive Durand Deacon was not isolated. She lived among hotel residents who knew her well, and they noticed her absence almost instantly. When she didn't return to her usual circles, concern mounted. Within a day, her friends reported her missing to the police. This action, so unlike the reaction after his earlier crimes, was crucial. The disappearance of Olive could not be written off as wartime evasion, sudden travel, or estrangement. There was no convenient explanation, and people expected answers quickly. The police investigation began immediately, and suspicions soon fell on High. He had been the last person seen with Olive, telling others at the hotel that they were going to Crawley together. Witnesses remembered this clearly, and the chain of events put him directly in their sights. When investigators searched his workshop, they found themselves inside a space that High thought to be a perfect hiding ground. Instead, it became the place that revealed everything. Among acid drums and chemical stains, they discovered items that Olive had carried with her. Most important were her dentures, imperfectly destroyed by the acid and still clearly recognizable. Small fragments of bone also remained, overlooked or resistant to the full effect of the acid. These physical remnants represented what he had believed impossible, evidence surviving where none should have been left. Even more significant was a simple item of daily life, a dry cleaning ticket. Found in the pocket of Olive's coat inside the workshop, it directly connected her to the site where High claimed nobody could trace her. That small scrap of paper, overlooked by High in his disposal efforts, became one of the strongest links tying him to her disappearance. The combination of the ticket, denture fragments, and recovered substances from the acid drums dismantled his illusion of the perfect crime. Forensic tests of the sludge confirmed traces of human fat and other biological material, further grounding the case in science rather than theory. High had always believed that no body, no crime was the rule he could exploit. Olive's disappearance proved otherwise. Her friend's vigilance and the speed of the missing persons report gave the police cause to act more swiftly than ever before. By investigating his fraud activities at the hotel and beyond, they matched his financial schemes with the timeline of her disappearance. For the first time, the fraud, the murder, and the method were all tied neatly together. In his past killings, gaps in records and limited social connections had kept questions from being asked. With Olive, those questions came hard and fast, leaving him no room to maneuver. The case against High developed rapidly. Every forensic detail mattered. Acid could dissolve flesh and tissue, but not completely eliminate all physical signs. Police officers collected sludge samples from the drains and tested them. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of human matter. The dentures, brittle but untouched by complete destruction, were given to Olive's dentist. They matched his patient records exactly, leaving no doubt about her identity. In an age where forensic science was considered limited, these pieces of proof carried enormous weight. They showed how small fragments could speak louder than total erasure. For High, one flawed assumption had ended his run: the belief that families or friends would always accept a convenient explanation and never pursue questions. Olive's community proved the opposite. It was not just the police, but the human element. Those who noticed when she failed to show up and insisted something was wrong, that turned suspicion into a case. The story of her disappearance highlighted how detection does not always rely on sophisticated methods, but sometimes on simple awareness and determination. Had the residents of Onslow Court not reported her absence, High might have bought himself more time. But in 1949, post-war life was beginning to stabilize, and missing people could not always be waved away with quick lies. The discovery of Olive's remains inside the Crawley workshop shocked investigators and cemented the trajectory of the investigation. By linking her to the acid drums and physical items left behind, they confirmed High's responsibility. It was the first case where his shadow pattern of fraud and murder was fully revealed to the authorities. Every earlier disappearance that had gone unchallenged suddenly began to look suspicious. McSwan, his parents, and the Hendersons, people who had simply vanished, were now re-evaluated under the same light. Investigators tied the evidence of fraud and abrupt transfers of wealth to a pattern that extended back years, all revolving around one man who believed he had outsmarted the law. Once arrested, High offered bizarre confessions, at times volunteering details as if eager to impress, but his confidence never fully returned. For the first time, the acid had not erased all traces. The dentures, the dry cleaning ticket, and the fragments washed through his drains stood against him. These were not elaborate finds, just overlooked everyday items that contradicted his image of precision and certainty. Olive's death proved not only his brutality, but also his fallibility. Olive Duran Deacon was the wrong target for his method. Her disappearance could not be disguised. Her friends could not be silenced through excuses, and her remains could not be destroyed entirely by a chemical bath. Forensic science and simple observation succeeded where his careful planning failed, and with evidence firmly in hand, the law had what it needed to charge John George High. This killing, unlike all the others, directly led to the trial that followed. High, desperate to escape responsibility, would claim insanity and present visions that he said justified his actions. The stage was set for one of Britain's most notorious courtrooms, where his attempt to argue madness would be tested against the cold, logical record of fraud, murder, and the fragments he left behind. Could Hai convince a jury that blood-drinking dreams excused his crimes? That was the story he carried into court in 1949. After his arrest, he admitted to killing multiple people, but claimed he was not in control of his actions. He described vivid dreams where he saw himself surrounded by blood, consumed by visions that told him he needed to kill. In his version, the murders were not about money, but about satisfying strange compulsions. He wanted the court to see him as insane, someone plagued by fantasies, not a calculating fraudster who had dissolved victims for financial gain. It was a dramatic plea, carefully chosen because he knew that if accepted, he could escape execution and spend his life in a hospital rather than a prison gallows. From the start, it was clear that the defense hoped to present Hai as a man gripped by uncontrollable urges. His claims about drinking blood from his victims' bodies shocked the public, but they also drew the attention he wanted. The idea of vampirism captured imaginations and played directly into the court of public opinion. Reporters filled headlines with the notion of a vampire killer, and for a short time, Hai's bizarre claims dominated the coverage. His lawyers attempted to frame his acts as those of a man detached from reality, influenced by nightmares, rituals, and visions that stretched back to his youth. It was a portrait that relied on eccentricity and mystery. If the jury believed it, he might avoid death, but the courtroom was not swayed easily by stories. The prosecution shifted focus back to Hai's actions, calculated, deliberate, and financially motivated. They pointed out how each of his so-called visions seemed to align with a pattern of acquiring wealth from his victims. He targeted people with assets, lured them to isolated workshops, and forged signatures after their deaths. Those were not the choices of a man broken by hallucinations, but of one rationally pursuing profit. Hai's effort to tie himself to dreams and rituals looked weaker with every detail the prosecutors revealed. In addition to dismantling his narrative, the prosecution presented evidence of his meticulous planning, renting workshops with proper drainage, purchasing drums, and obtaining large quantities of sulfuric acid required time, money, and organization. Each step suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. The idea that he killed under the influence of a sudden dream or uncontrollable urge grew difficult to accept. Witnesses also came forward to describe his behavior before and after the killings. He had spoken about business arrangements, forged paperwork, and tried to collect rents, all with clarity of mind. That was not the behavior of a man disconnected from reality, but of one using violence to secure fraud. Hai's own words also weakened his case. During questioning, he openly admitted to several murders, but not from guilt. Rather, he described the acts in detail, as if he wanted to impress investigators. There was little sign of confusion or delusion in those accounts. Instead, they demonstrated pride in his efficiency and his so-called perfect method of body disposal. In court, these admissions made it plain that he understood what he was doing. They did not support a narrative of insanity, only arrogance. His conduct both before and after the crimes made it easy for attorneys to show that he was methodical, not unhinged. The defense, hoping to salvage the case, relied heavily on medical witnesses. Psychiatrists were brought in to discuss his supposed delusions and compulsions, citing his early dreams and his talk of blood rituals. But even in this, the cracks showed. Other experts testified that his overall actions pointed to a man fully aware of right and wrong and capable of controlling himself. The dreams may have been strange, but strange dreams did not equal insanity. The jury was asked to weigh whether his killings came from madness or cold planning. Context mattered too. Post-war Britain was still reeling from loss and hardship, but it was also a society determined to restore order. Crimes that stood out as senseless attracted harsh judgment, and Hai's actions embodied senselessness on a grand scale. The press labelled him monstrous, not because of his claims about drinking blood, but because of the cruelty of dissolving bodies and leaving families without closure. The public mood was not sympathetic. People wanted punishment, not excuses. That atmosphere carried into the court and shaped the reception of his defense. The jury, representing the public, did not see him as someone to pity. When the prosecution tied everything together, they emphasized that Hai's murders followed his frauds step for step. First came the trust, then the killing, then the acid bath, and finally the forged papers to profit. There was nothing random or unpredictable about it. Each victim had assets he wanted. Each was dissolved in workshops specially prepared for concealment. There was no evidence that hallucinations drove him to attack strangers or to lash out without reason. Instead, his victims were chosen carefully, methodically, and always linked to financial gain. Insanity could not explain away such a clear sequence of actions. By the end of the trial, The jury had heard everything: his macabre confessions, the expert testimony, the evidence pulled from his workshops, and the testimonies about missing people linked to his fraud. It took them only minutes to reach a verdict. John George High was found guilty of murder. For all his claims about blood, dreams, and compulsion, the court saw through it. The conclusion was clear. He was not out of touch with reality. He was in full possession of his intent, motivated by money, and entirely responsible for the deaths he caused. The sentence was death by hanging. It was customary at the time, and in August 1949, High was executed at Wandsworth Prison. The very man who believed he had devised the perfect way to conceal his crimes ended at the gallows, exposed by overlooked fragments and his own arrogance. In the end, none of his rituals, visions, or elaborate claims could save him. His death closed the chapter on one of Britain's most notorious criminal cases, but the echoes of it carried forward. The High trial did more than convict a killer. It demonstrated how courts could secure a murder conviction without a complete body. Before, the doctrine of no body, no crime was often repeated. But with advances in forensic methods and evidence like denture fragments, chemical traces, and personal possessions, prosecutors proved that lack of a whole body did not mean lack of proof. In High's case, it was enough to show what he left behind, however small, and to connect those remains with the missing victims. That legal development was significant, influencing how future cases were prosecuted. The execution closed High's personal story, but it opened wider debates about trust, fraud, and the terrifying possibility of murder as an extension of financial crime. He was not a killer driven by sudden rage. He was a fraudster who calculated that murder was the best way to continue his scams safely. The trial exposed this reality and reminded society that greed could grow into violence. As the rope was placed around his neck, the illusion he had built of a brilliant criminal above the law was finally shattered. From then on, he lived only in the history books, not as the vampire figure he liked to pretend, but as a man who believed acid could erase his crimes, only to be defeated by fragments, evidence, and human vigilance. What lessons does this case still hold, decades later? The crimes of John George High did not end with his execution. His story continued to echo across law enforcement, the courts, and even in popular culture. Officially, he was convicted of 6 murders: William McSwan, Donald and Amy McSwan, Archibald and Rosalie Henderson, and Olive Duran Deacon. These were the victims the police could connect to physical evidence, fraudulent documents, and clear patterns of disappearance. But there were more claims, whispered by High himself after his arrest. He boasted of killing 3 others, bringing the number to 9, though no proof was ever found. Whether or not those additional killings were real, the suggestion alone deepened public fascination. For some, it painted him not just as a fraudster turned killer, but as a predator comfortable exaggerating his own scale to appear fearsome. The uncertainty kept his case alive long after the trial ended. One of the first major impacts was seen in how courts thought about evidence. Before High, many people repeated the idea that, without a body, no conviction was possible. But his murders challenged that assumption. In Olive Duran Deacon's case, almost nothing remained but a few bone fragments, denture pieces, and residue tested for human fat. The court still convicted him. For jurors, these fragments were enough to prove death and to link High directly. That legal outcome showed both lawyers and the public that a total body was not needed to reach a verdict. Traces, even small ones, could form the backbone of a murder case. Legal historians later pointed to this trial when discussing the shift toward allowing forensic science and fragmentary findings as sufficient evidence. It became an early lesson in expanding how guilt could be proven, even when a murderer attempted the most extreme methods of erasure. For forensic awareness, the case demonstrated how chemistry intersected with law. Sulfuric acid could hide flesh, but it could not make fragments of metal or dentures vanish completely. Scientists tested the sludge left at High's workshop, identifying minerals, fats, and materials that pointed clearly to human remains. This carried a message that any attempt to create the so-called perfect crime was flawed. Something always lasted. That idea grew into a guiding principle for later forensic work, that every act leaves a trace, even when chemicals, destruction, or erasure are used. Today, crime laboratories use far more advanced techniques, but the principle is the same. Hay's case provided one of Britain's most memorable demonstrations of this truth. Outside courtrooms, the public absorbed the story in a different way. Newspapers in the late 1940s published lurid accounts of his use of acid baths, and his nickname, the acid bath murderer, never left him. He became a cultural figure, not because anyone admired him, but because the sheer horror of his method captured attention. People struggled to imagine how a man could calmly pour acid over a human body and watch as it dissolved. That image lasted far longer than the trial itself. Within months of his execution, his likeness appeared at Madame Tussauds in London. The waxwork displayed him with chilling realism, drawing thousands of visitors. It stood as a reminder that the line between curiosity and horror was thin, and people continued to come face to face with the figure who used acid as a murder weapon. In the years after, dramatizations and retellings sprang up. High became a character in true crime books, radio discussions, films, and eventually television episodes that revisited his crimes. The way he combined fraud, charm, and murder gave creators a template to show how respectability could conceal violence. Each variation reinforced the danger of assuming appearances told the whole story. A polite man in a suit, playing piano at dinner, might at the same time be planning to erase a family in acid. Decades later, his crimes remained present because the mix of deception and brutality was so unsettling. True crime production in Britain often cited his case as one of the most distinct, a reminder of how easily killers can hide behind ordinary faces. On a deeper level, High's story illustrated how financial crime can grow into calculated violence. His murders were not born from sudden rage or accidents. They grew out of fraud. Each victim represented more than a life. They were also resources he could acquire if he eliminated anyone who might stand in his way. Fraud turned into a calculated business model, with murder as its protection. This connection drew attention from criminologists and psychologists who examined escalation, how crimes shift from lesser offences into darker, irreversible acts. High stood as an example. Theft and forgery were the practice field, but eventually they required something more extreme to sustain themselves. His confidence with deception paved the road for lethal acts that seemed, for years, invisible. There was also a broader cultural lesson about the illusion of control. High convinced himself that acid erased everything. In his mind, no witness and no body meant no conviction. Yet, for all his chemical planning, it was human vigilance, neighbours noticing absences, friends reporting disappearances, that triggered the investigation. And once police began to search his workshops, the acid was far from flawless. Dentures remained, paperwork carried mistakes, and everyday items like a dry cleaning ticket stayed in pockets. The lesson was unmistakable. Even the most carefully planned crime collapses under pressure because perfection is impossible. The cracks, human or material, always show. When people visit a waxwork, watch a dramatization, or read about Hay in A History of Crime, they see more than just one man's violence. They see the clash of imagination and reality, the idea of a perfect disappearance met by the truth that fragments endure. That is why his name stayed present in Britain's crime memory, not because of a fascination with fraud, but because he pushed fraud into murder with an unusual method, and still failed. The failure itself was as instructive as the killing. It told jurists, scientists, and ordinary citizens alike that there is no formula to erase a human being without leaving something behind. For students of criminology, Hay became a study in escalation and arrogance. He played roles: organist, chauffeur, solicitor, smooth businessman. Each role was performed with skill, yet each was hollow. His charm bought him trust, his fraud bought him money, and his murder bought him silence. But in the end, he was remembered not for success, but for the flaws he overlooked. The hook of his story, that acid could erase everything, became the hook of his downfall. Even today, discussions of white-collar crime often trace back to how greed, when unchecked, can grow into predation on lives themselves. His story keeps that warning alive. Culturally, fascination with High remains because of the way his crimes fit into Britain's post-war climate. It was a time when everyday life mixed with disruption, when missing neighbours could be explained by war. Hay exploited that system. The shift back to stability after the war made his final crime stand out even more sharply. People saw that stability itself exposed him. Once life grew more orderly, disappearances could not be slipped past communities, and that contrast between wartime cover and post-war accountability gave the case its distinct shape. It is part of why Olive Durand-Deacon's disappearance hit differently than those before, and why her friends' reports became the critical undoing of his cycle. What remains today is the reminder that High should not be remembered only as a killer. His story is better understood as a study of how crimes escalate, of how fraud can darken into murder, and of how a myth of perfect concealment always breaks. His case lives as much in classrooms as in museums. Lawyers, Forensic scientists, criminologists, and writers all continue to point back to him when explaining how small traces dismantle large illusions. He was a man who thought chemistry could erase humanity itself. But dentures, receipts, and the memories of ordinary people did what he thought acid destroyed. They brought his victims back into view. And looking at today's world, it is sobering to realize how much more quickly his crimes would unravel under modern forensic science. DNA analysis, chemical testing, digital tracking of records, and advanced surveillance would close the gaps that High once relied on. The misplaced confidence he had in acid as a solution could not withstand modern scrutiny. The very thought of planning such vanishing acts today ends before it begins, not because greed and deception have vanished, but because science now leaves almost no place for such illusions to hide.